Chapter 900. The residence that Brando arranged for Prince Leneret was located on the east side of Valhalla, in a palace formed by hollowing out the trunk of a tree. This was one of Valhalla's abilities. As long as one paid a certain amount of mana in the town hall, the tree fortress would be able to create an unlimited number of caverns. Of course, to turn these caverns into rooms, one would need to decorate them. Brendel asked Amandina and Odin to design a palace that was modeled after Coldwood Castle to serve as Valhalla's guest rooms. Now this luxurious guest room was exclusively occupied by the eldest prince of the Cruise people. Outside the guest room, day or night, there were Cruise's folded sword knights guarding it in shifts. Most of these folded sword knights knew Brando, and after notifying him and getting Leneret's approval, they respectfully let him in. The entrance to the palace was cleverly arranged. It was located on a terrace connected by a vine path, the other end of the path connected to the second level of the treetop square above. The entrance was very remote and guarded by tree elf archers. Right in front of the terrace was the main branch of the giant tree that extended upward. In that direction, there were tree elf archers' outposts and tree houses hidden between the branches, but through the lush shade on both sides of the branches, one could still see the scenery of the mountains and the clouds to the east. It could be said that both safety and the owner of the place could enjoy the wonderful scenery. It was an excellent design. At the entrance, there were vines full of green leaves hanging down from the tree wall, as if forming a curtain. Behind it was the main hall of the palace. This main hall was also half open. There was a giant crystal above the hall that could filter the light from the outside, allowing sunlight or moonlight to pour on the magic fountain in the center of the hall, allowing the sparkling spring water to gush over the pebbles. When Brando and Amandina walked into the hall, they happened to see the eldest prince of the Cruise people standing by the spring, looking down at the sparkling golden water flow, thinking about something. "Your Highness Leneret, are you satisfied with your stay?" Brando walked to a place not far from him and stopped to greet him. Leneret looked back at them and nodded, but did not answer, only waiting for them to speak. This guy is still as boring as ever, Boo thought. He took the initiative to speak. "Your Highness Leneret, the Wind Elves have started a war in the wilderness of the Four Realms, and the Golden Mane Lion men are also gathering an army. The Holy War can be said to have begun. I wonder what your Highness thinks about this." Since the start of the Holy War, the Silver Queen had no choice but to rely heavily on the military nobles in the Empire, and most of these nobles supported the eldest son of the Emperor. Leneret nodded silently and asked, "According to the usual practice, the Holy Cathedral of Fire should have summoned the envoys of various countries to Rushta. I haven't had the time to congratulate Mr. Count on being appointed as the head of the envoy group. His Highness Leneret has also lived in Tonajul for some time. He wouldn't not want to return to the Empire, would he?" The eldest son of the Cruise people raised his head and looked at him with light blue eyes. That indifferent gaze seemed to say, "Could it be that you, a little Count of Tonajul, also want to intervene in the battle for the throne of the Empire?" Brando spread his hands and smiled slightly. "Your Highness, it's not that I want to pull chestnuts out of the fire, but I have no choice. I have no intention of intervening in the internal affairs of the Cruise people, especially the most troublesome battle for the throne. But now that things have come to this, I have to think of a way to protect myself. This matter is good for you, and good for me, so I would like to get some advice from you." "What advice?" Leneret asked. "First of all, I want to know, in the Empire, who will spare no effort to support you." Leneret frowned slightly, as if considering the value of this meeting. After a moment of consideration, he gestured to Brando. The gesture meant, "Please come inside and talk," and then turned and walked in the direction of the study. Brendel seemed to have expected this, and he brought Amandina along to follow them. They went all the way to the study. There were a few light spirits in the study waiting for the eldest son's instructions. Leneret asked them to set up the room and put black tea and snacks. Although these light spirits also listened to Brando's orders, Brando was good-natured and waited for the eldest son of the crew's people to exercise his authority, although his authority was also limited to this palace. A moment later, when a few light spirits flew out of the room, the eldest son of the crew's people solemnly replied, "Mr. Count, the Octavier family is my wife's family, and Duke Ludwig will spare no effort to support me." Brando really did not expect the eldest son of the emperor to already have a wife at such a young age. However, this kind of political marriage in Wonde was equivalent to taking sides. The Octavier family could be said to be tied to Leneret for good or ill, so Duke Ludwig in the crew's empire could be regarded as the kind of person that the eldest son of the emperor could completely trust. "What else?" he continued to ask. "The Nona family is my ally." "What's going on?" Brando asked. "Old Marquis Enoan had publicly opposed the succession of the late king to my mother, so he had a grudge with my mother. This kind of hatred will not be resolved with the passage of time, so the most eager to have my mother abdicate is the Nona family. I have a secret agreement with the Nona family, and Marquis Enoan promised to give me a portion of Enoan's mining shares and unreservedly support me in seizing the throne." Leneret replied calmly. Brando suddenly understood, no wonder Mangrove was in such a hurry to come from the Empire to Tonajol. The Empire's army was divided into 4, and the current Marquis Enoan Mangrove was the commander of the Black Legion. In addition, the Azure Legion was in the hands of the Erehik family behind Veronica. The Nigel family, which was related to the royal family by blood, controlled the White Legion on the border of Hazel and the Red Legion on the border of St. Tassol. These 3 families were the typical representatives of the military aristocracy in the north. The attitude of these military aristocrats was generally biased towards the eldest son of the emperor's succession, but this only represented one attitude. According to Leneret's words, the only one who was really willing to contribute should be the Nona family. Brando noted this point and continued to ask, "Anything else?" "The old Prime Minister Nidivin." "Prime Minister Nidivin?" Brando was shocked and asked again almost in disbelief. The old Prime Minister of the Cruz Empire, Nidivin, was not an ordinary person. He should be more than 150 years old now, and was an elder of the empire for 3 generations. 100 years ago, it was with his help that the Emperor of Cruz regained power from the Holy Cathedral. If there was any legend of the people of Cruz in this era, it should be the Prime Minister. And with his identity and wisdom, or to put it bluntly, such an old fox, how could he easily choose a side? Brando looked at the eldest son of the Cruz Empire suspiciously, and Leneret replied slowly, "Mother's favor to the Pallet family is actually to use the power of the local aristocrats to suppress other forces in the court. The military aristocrats in the north rarely intervene in government affairs, so her purpose is known to the world, nothing more than the Prime Minister and the Holy Cathedral. The Prime Minister understands that Mother has no good feelings for him, so naturally he will not stand on that side. But he may not stand on your side either." Brando thought to himself that the Empire had plenty of princes and princesses, and it was not to the extent that there would be no heir just because of the loss of the eldest son. However, the eldest son was at least right about one thing, and that was that no matter which prince or princess was chosen to inherit the Empire, the old Prime Minister would not stand on the side of the Silver Queen. That was enough. He silently calculated that the 3 forces mentioned by Leneret came from the distant relatives of the royal family, the military aristocrats, and the general aristocrats. The most hardcore of them should be Duke Ludwig of the Octavier family, followed by the Nona family. The old Prime Minister Nidivin could only be regarded as a potential ally, or rather, an enemy. Brando still remembered that he had offended the daughter of the Prime Minister of the Empire, the precious granddaughter of the old Prime Minister, so he would try not to provoke her if he could. On the surface, there were several forces in the Cruz Empire, the royal family, the military aristocrats, the local aristocrats, and the Holy Sanctum. These 4 forces basically controlled most of the Empire's land, population, resources, and army. The Empire's land, population, and resources were of little significance to Brando. The most important thing for his plan was the army. In the Empire's army, the 4 traditional legions were controlled by the military aristocrats, and the royal family controlled 2 of them through marriage. The patrolling cavalry and local garrison forces in various areas had always been the traditional sphere of influence of the local aristocrats, including the newly risen navy. However, the local aristocrats were divided into 2, with the royal family and the holy sanctum each occupying one of them. The royal family was more closely related to the autonomous grand duchies in the north, while the holy sanctum mainly influenced the small and large lords in the south. Finally, the holy sanctum itself also had a military force that could not be underestimated, including the most elite part of the crew's army, such as the bishops and the Flame family knights. Brando thought about it and suddenly realized that he had missed something. What about Veronica? Shouldn't she also support His Royal Highness? He raised his head and asked Lenarette this question somewhat strangely. The eldest prince of the crew's empire glanced at him and shook his head. "Mr. Count, the teacher supports me because of the honor and sense of justice of the military, but the Arizic family behind the teacher may not stand on my side." Brando understood what was going on after hearing this, and he could not help but be in awe. The names mentioned by Lenarette before, including the military aristocrats in the north, could at most be called qualified politicians, but this female legion commander was a real soldier and knight of the empire. He tapped his knuckles and began to analyze while replying to Lenarette, "I have probably understood, Your Royal Highness. Let's now determine what our goal is." In Brando's heart, what he most wanted to see was, of course, the prince returning directly to the empire and pulling his supporters to fight against Her Royal Highness. The slightest result of this would be a coup, but the more likely result would be a civil war. Of course, this idea was just a thought. The eldest prince was not a fool, and his supporters had not been affected by the halo of retardation. The ultimate goal of a plan depended on the power they had now. A beggar would not rashly dream of becoming a king. A farmer's long-term plan was mostly to buy a few more acres of land, not to become a wealthy merchant who could traverse the 4 seas. And the goal Brando set for Lenarette was self-preservation. Self-preservation. The eldest prince of the crew's people chewed on the word carefully. Self-preservation. First, ensure that my supporters in the empire will not be swept away by my mother. Is that what you mean? Damn, this is a monster, Brando could not help but curse in his heart. Although he had heard about the wisdom and strength of the eldest prince in history, but when he really faced him, he could not help but feel that his IQ was crushed by the other party by several levels. He, Amandina, and Carglass had discussed this plan several times, and finally decided on the details one by one. He did not expect the other party to guess what they meant just by hearing the name. The Silver Queen had set such a grand goal of unifying Wond, and what she had to do was to gather the army first. It was conceivable that she would definitely start with the Nona family first, and she had previously suppressed the northern nobles in preparation for this day. The military nobles were not fools, and naturally understood the principle that if one were to prosper, all would prosper, and if one were to suffer, all would suffer. The only way Her Majesty could deal with them was to use the peaceful period to reduce the army and the power in the hands of these nobles. But the early arrival of the Holy War forced the Silver Queen to let go of the restraints on the northern nobles, because she knew very well that she still had many opponents in the empire. If she lost in the Holy War, then these opponents hiding in the dark would jump out together to force her to abdicate. She had been in the empire for 40 years, and according to the previous agreement, she should have abdicated long ago. If she wanted to continue to rule this huge empire, she had to increase her prestige and give herself a legitimate reason not to leave. The best reason was that she could lead the people of Cruz to victory. And this was the opportunity for Brando and the eldest son of the emperor. But at this time, not only could they not stand up against the Supreme One, but they also had to restrain themselves and try not to give her a chance to make mistakes. On the surface, the only army that Lenarette could control was the Black Legion, plus the local noble forces that Duke Dugweg could influence in the north. But in fact, the Silver Queen could not control too many troops, only the Red and White Legions. But compared to the eldest son of the emperor, she had more potential enemies. She was on bad terms with the Kirk family, the Holy Cathedral, and the Prime Minister. The Eriziko family was said to be very close to the Flower Leaf territory, so they would not be determined to support Her Majesty. On the contrary, although they were not loyal allies of the eldest son of the emperor, there was no shortage of opportunities to turn enemies into friends, because at least they had a common enemy. Brando's proposal to Leneret was to first secretly connect his forces in the country in his name to help each other, and then hide deep in the dark. This was a means of self-protection. Self-protection itself was a kind of defense, but defense was also for counterattack. This holy war was an indescribable whirlpool for the Cruz Empire. The Holy Cathedral wanted to win, and the Silver Queen also wanted to win, but the Holy Cathedral was not willing to make a wedding dress for the Silver Queen, and presumably the Supreme One of the Empire had the same idea. And the local nobles also had their own ulterior motives. There were hardcore supporters of the Queen, and there were also supporters of the Holy Cathedral. When the two sides wrestled with each other, the power owned by the eldest son of the emperor became a decisive force. If he chose to remain silent, then the Silver Queen's plan to integrate the power of the empire to achieve military victory in the Holy War could be said to have failed by half. In the face of this situation, it was not surprising that the old Prime Minister, Naidevan, would look on coldly, and the attitude of the local nobles would change over time. Because of a very simple principle. A newly ascended emperor and an iron-blooded queen who had ruled the empire for 40 years had a completely different power in terms of governing ability. No local nobles would like an overly powerful emperor. This was a universal truth in Wond, so it was self-evident who they would eventually side with. When the prestige of Her Majesty the Queen weakened day by day with the deepening of the war, then the voices forcing her to abdicate would one day reach a consensus among all the nobles. At that time, Leneret could justifiably return to the empire and receive the support of the nobles. This was the final counterattack. Of course, self-protection at this stage was also good for Brando. He wanted to go to the empire to take back the Azure Lance and Scarlet, and it was conceivable that his enemies should be Her Majesty the Queen and the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Therefore, the last thing he wanted to see was a completely unified empire, whether under the name of the Silver Queen or the Holy Cathedral. Therefore, what he had to do was to maintain the chaotic status quo of the empire and seek opportunities for himself with the help of the opposition from many sides. At the same time, Leneret's allies in the north could also provide him with the necessary protection, such as arranging a safe channel for him to escape the empire. In this regard, he and the eldest son of the Kurlutzians had common interests. Leneret listened carefully to Amandina's analysis and nodded silently. He finally looked at Brando, and his gaze was no longer so cold. He thought for a moment before he replied, "Count, thank you for your frank proposal. I think I can trust you completely. If one day I ascend the throne, then your friendship with me today will become a precious witness." Brando smiled slightly and finally breathed a sigh of relief in his heart. "Then it's a pleasure to work with you, Your Highness," he replied. Leneret nodded slightly to him as a sign of acknowledgement, but his stern face did not loosen in the slightest. He thought for a moment and suddenly said, "As a friend, I have some personal advice that I can tell you, Count." Brando was slightly taken aback and asked, "What advice?" "I know my mother's character and conduct very well. Your subordinate is in her hands, and she will definitely use you and Erwin to coerce her into submission. I think, Count, if your subordinate's inner world is not very indestructible, you'd better do something to give her some confidence." The eldest prince replied faintly. Sure enough, His Royal Highness already knew the real reason why he came here. Brando thought in his heart, but he immediately realized that the information provided by Prince Leneret was very deceptive. He thought for a moment and felt that with Her Majesty's character of not giving up until she achieved her goal, she would most likely do so. Thinking of this, he suddenly felt that his trip was not a loss. He hurriedly nodded to the eldest prince of the Cruz people. "I understand what to do, thank you very much. Correction, yesterday's scene 55 should be scene 56. Today, I will release the first chapter, scene 57, and there will be another one later. I hope everyone will enjoy it, and I also hope everyone will support me and spend more monthly votes. Chapter 901. It was the last few days of the month of frost, and the weather outside was so cold that it made one's teeth chatter. The deciduous forests around Maxen and Schaflund couldn't escape the bleak scene. The trees were starting to become bare, and a thick layer of withered leaves had fallen on the ground since late autumn. It was as if a gray carpet had been laid out in layers between the trees. There were even a few light snowfalls in the northern regions. Although it wasn't to the extent of being covered in snow, it was at least an omen of winter in the year of the sword. This was the worst month of the year to start a war, but the Holy War just had to start at this time. History was always so unreasonable, and sometimes it was even more whimsical than the stories described. In AB's, only the black pine forest outside the Baron's castle was still tall and green in the midst of the solemn atmosphere of war. However, there was a faint black color between the canopy of the trees, as if the entire shade of the trees was a ghost hovering overhead. When the cold wind whistled past the tips of the pine trees, it made a strange whistling sound that made one's hair stand on end. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. The guests of Trondheim were stomping their feet and rubbing their hands as they complained about the horrible weather. Most of them were dressed in bright clothes and had the air of a big city. They didn't look like locals at all. A dozen or so carriages were parked outside the courtyard, their bodies painted with all kinds of emblems. Each one represented the glorious history of a family. These nobles came from all over the Arowan, and most of them were here for the first time in Tonajol. They were here for only one purpose, to go on a diplomatic mission to the Cruz Empire. It was also a rare time for AB's castle to be lively, although it didn't matter if the owner was willing to receive these guests. Although the diplomatic mission to the Cruz Empire was nominally headed by Brando, and he could choose any members to accompany him, an ancient tradition dictated that there must be a fixed number of seats in the diplomatic mission, and these seats were what Brando couldn't designate. Among them, there was a representative of the royal family, and Prince Haruz would represent the House of Corvado. In addition, he could also choose 2 maids, an attendant, and an accompanying knight. The original list included Madame Windsor and Madame Sigma, the 2 nannies of His Royal Highness when he was in Winterclaw Castle. However, Haruz asked Brando to replace Madame Windsor with Medusa Lysimachia at the last minute, which made Brando wonder if the prince had reached the age of love. As for his attendant, he was a young man from Corvado, whom Brando had never heard of before. He must be a member of the royal family, and the accompanying knight was naturally the most trusted candidate of Her Royal Highness Maynard. In addition to the Corvado royal family, according to the agreement of the Holy Cathedral, Erowin's former royal family, the Cipher royal family, should also send a representative. However, this representative naturally couldn't travel thousands of miles across Ampere Seal for a week or 2 to meet them here. Her Royal Highness's brother had already sent a letter to tell them that he had chosen the candidate, and that the envoy and his entourage would meet them in Grey Mountain, so his sister and the Count didn't have to worry too much. Then, for dukes, Viro, Grinoires, Lantanilan, Karsuk, and 3 counts, Count Janilasu, Count Yenbao, and Count Grey Mountain, plus a Marquis of Balta, each with a representative. There were originally supposed to be representatives of Erech and Radnor, but now these 2 territories had been removed, and they were both part of the royal family's territory and part of Tonajol. Erech's family was few in number, and after the Battle of Ampere Seal, they were basically wiped out. Count Radnor and his family were still in prison in Majidin, so naturally, it was impossible for them to send any representatives. Among the 4 dukes, Duke Viro directly sent his youngest daughter, Duke Talanlan's envoy, Duke Eek, and Duke Karsuk sent a meatball, who was said to be his second son. As for Duke Grinoires, he also sent a daughter, but she was only a little girl of 7 or 8 years old. Count Janilasu was a believer of the Silver Lion Association. He did not have a wife, so naturally, he did not have any children. He sent a sergeant whom he thought highly of, a very energetic young man. The envoy of the Count of Grey Mountain also did not come to Tonajol, so naturally, he was waiting with the envoy of Cipher to meet them in Grey Mountain. In the end, there was a little twist in the choice of Count Yenbao's envoy, because there was no news of Count Yenbao for a long time. In the middle of the month of Frost, Baron Dahl sent an envoy himself, but he was directly driven away by the angry princess. In the end, Dilferi decided to personally serve as Yenbao's envoy. First, she could leave an impression on the Holy Cathedral of Fire as the future successor of Yenbao, and second, she could thwart Baron Dahl's conspiracy. Brando considered her physical condition and specially prepared a larger carriage for her. Most of these nobles had their own attendants, ranging from 1 to 3. Thus, when added together, it was a bloated group of 20 or so people and 5 or 6 carriages. However, if one thought that this group was large enough, then one would be gravely mistaken. Brando soon found that there were some unexpected guests in this team. One of them was Princess Magadol. As the Princess of Antiburo, she naturally had to represent her duchy to Cruz. Originally, the Empire thought that she had died in the war in Ampere Seal, so the order was also passed to the duchy, hoping that the duchy could send another envoy to Cruz. But this news somehow reached the ears of the nun princess, and after she heard the news, she insisted on being the envoy of Antiburo to the Empire. She also privately communicated with the Antiburo royal family, so Brando naturally could not stop her. After all, the princess was recuperating in Tonajol and was not under house arrest, so he had no reason to restrict her freedom to contact the outside world. And another uninvited guest was now in front of Brando. At this moment, Brando was staring at the merchant lady in front of him. She was wearing a thick fur coat, boots, gloves, a scarf, and a bearskin hat. Her small face was almost only revealing a pair of black eyes. He looked at the large suitcase in her small hands and finally couldn't help but ask, "Well, now can you tell me, what are you planning to do here?" "Go to the Empire with Brando, I haven't been there yet." The little Roman raised her chin, revealing her small mouth from under the scarf, and answered matter-of-factly. Brando rolled his eyes. "Of course I know that, but I already said that there are no more places for the diplomatic group. Besides, you don't seem to remember, I told you to stay in Tonajol obediently and leave yourself in a safer place. Don't make me worry, do you understand?" He couldn't help but facepalm. This girl clearly promised him yesterday that there were no more places for the diplomatic group, and told him to stay in the territory obediently and support Amandina. She clearly promised that she would never take up a place in the diplomatic group. Wait, Brando suddenly froze in place. He reacted and glared at the young lady. "Oh, damn it, you're playing word games with me again." "Nope." Little Roman blew a puff of white air on his hand and replied with a smile, "I'm the rightful one." "Justified my ass." Brando pinched her face. "Listen to me obediently, stay in Tonajol, you're not allowed to go anywhere." Brendel pinched Romaine's cheeks for a long time, but she kept waving her hands, trying to break free from his grip, but her mouth did not loosen. He could not help but become a little suspicious. This was not in line with her temperament. He could not help but let go of his hand and ask doubtfully, "All right, tell me, what exactly are you going to do in the Empire?" The little Roman rubbed her red cheeks and showed a fierce look. "I've been invited by the Holy Cathedral of Fire, as the president of the Seven Seas Merchant Guild, and as a distinguished guest of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, I'm going to the Cruz Empire to participate in the ceremony of the Holy War." She deliberately emphasized the word distinguished guest, and then handed the invitation to Brando. Brando opened the parchment letter and almost blacked out and fell to the ground. It was true that the Holy Cathedral of Fire would invite some famous businessmen, poets, and even artists and scholars from various fields to participate in the annual large-scale celebrations or ceremonies of the opening of the Holy War. But he never dreamed that Roman, his somewhat muddle-headed and unreliable fiancée, would be on the list. He couldn't help but read the letter over and over again several times, and finally confirmed that the magic wax seal on the letter was the real emblem of the Holy Cathedral. After confirming that there was no mistake, he had to admit that this thing did not look fake. He raised his head and looked at the Roman as if he was looking at an alien. "When did your business become so big?" "Very long ago. The Holy Cathedral of Fire invited me to the Harvest Festival this year, but at that time they were going to amp your seal. I've already been there, so I don't want to go anymore. It's not fun at all." The little Roman replied casually, as if the invitation from the Holy Cathedral of Fire was just an invitation for her to go on a trip, and whether she would go or not depended on her mood. Brando almost knelt down to her. The Holy Cathedral of Fire's tradition of inviting celebrities had always existed in the game. At that time, there were some famous merchant guilds among the players in Erewhon. Until the Second Era, these merchant guilds with major sponsors behind them would often break their heads over such an invitation letter. There were even a few instances where it almost led to a war between the merchant guilds. At least, Brando had seen it happen a few times. Brando carefully looked at his almighty fiancée, and felt that there must be something like Martha's daughter behind this. But in the end, it was Amandina who cleared his doubts. It turned out that many of the resources produced in the Black Forest, including some precious magic materials and magic crystals, were strategic resources that the Holy Cathedral of Fire urgently needed, especially during the period before the start of the Holy War. Tanajal's large exports in the past year had long made it an important partner in the eyes of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, so it was not surprising that the Roman, the nominal president of the Seven Seas Merchant Guild, was valued by the Holy Cathedral. But Brando shook his head, still thinking that Amandina had used a cheat. One must know that to become a merchant that could trade with the Holy Cathedral of Fire, it was not only enough to have a supply of goods, but also required a considerable network of contacts. He did not have to think to guess that the Roman must have used the connections of the merchant guilds in Ampere Seal. But as for how she did it, it was a bit ridiculous. Because this could only be explained by a miracle in Amandina's opinion. "Can I go now, Brando?" The little Roman covered her face and asked pitifully, but there was clearly a little pride in her voice. "Up to you, Brando replied in a bad mood. He felt that in front of this little fiancée of his intelligence and sense of existence as a count had been severely devalued, and this made him feel very hurt. "Then Brando, help me prepare a carriage. I want the one I usually use, with a stove that can put charcoal on it." "No, go to my carriage obediently." "Oh." After sending away the Roman lady and the second son of Duke Karsuk, who was almost the same height and width, who had been trying to get close to him, Brando finally broke away from the group of young masters and ladies. He walked to the side of the carriage and just happened to see Ferlin coming out of the castle with a notebook in her hand. When he saw the elder of the Wild Elf sisters, he knew that the things she had prepared were probably done, and hurriedly greeted her. "Ferlin." "My lord. Are Brunhilde and the others ready?" The elder of the Wild Elf sisters nodded. "Very good." Brendel finally let out a sigh of relief in his heart. This trip was not really to bring these young ladies and young masters out for a vacation, it was just a pretense on the surface. Moreover, Princess Griffine had appointed him as the leader of the envoy group, and even appointed him as the commander of the Southern Legion. This appointment had arrived earlier, and it was obvious that she wanted him to transfer the elites from Tonajol to form the accompanying guards for this envoy group. This was a tradition that had been tacitly agreed upon. Before the start of the Holy War, the Empire had summoned the envoys of the various kingdoms and duchies, and this had become a tradition since the First Holy War. Today, this was not only a way for the Holy Cathedral of Fire to confirm the confidence of the participants, but also a way for the vassal states to compete with each other to obtain a higher status in the Holy Cathedral of Fire. In this envoy group, first of all, the noble families had to greet the representatives of the empire. This in itself represented a respectful submission, and was also a way for the vassal states to pledge their allegiance to the Holy Cathedral. Of course, this kind of greeting was not so blatant, and appeared to be a little more reserved. On the other hand, there was the accompanying guards of the envoy group. After all, the Holy War was a war, and every country needed to show their strength to the Holy Cathedral of Fire to obtain a corresponding status in the war, and even after. The guards of this envoy group were a means of showing off. Generally speaking, the guards of the envoy group were the most elite forces of each country, representing the highest standard of the duchies and kingdoms, and also the face of the nobles and the royal family. In order to maintain this face and glory, the guards of these envoys would even compete with each other in the Cruz Empire and clash with each other. Of course, this kind of conflict rarely resulted in bloodshed, but the side that lost face most of the time would not have a good time after returning to their country. The strongest group of guards of the envoy group in all the previous holy wars should be the guards of the Black Raven Duchy in the west of the empire. This duchy was adjacent to the Hazel people and the Holy Cathedral of Earth. Although the duchy accepted the faith of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, most of the inhabitants were half-orcs and half-beastmen, and the people were very valiant, and the nobles were also very martial. At that time, they sent a guard composed of bear warriors, and whether it was in terms of quantity or quality, they crushed the guards of the other countries. Unfortunately, they met the Eruin people of that era. In that holy war, the envoy group sent by the Eruin people could be said to be the most shabby one in all the previous holy wars. Other than the nobles' representatives, the envoy group was made up of officers of the White Lion Legion, and there were less than 20 people in total. However, the problem was that the captain of this group of 20 people was the Earth Sword Saint Darius, and the vice-captain was the scholar of the Mithril Fortress, Tolman. With just these two people, they swept away everyone, including Cruz's people. As for how Brando's famous grandfather later became the marshal of the Allied forces, that was another story. The envoy group was the face of Eruin, and Tonajul was now the strongest territory in the entire Eruin Empire. Therefore, when the princess chose Brando to be the leader of the envoy group, although the royal faction had objections, they did not dare to oppose too much. As for Brando and Her Royal Highness, the two of them had reached a tacit understanding, and they used this as an excuse to brazenly stuff people into this so-called guard group. As for why these people would go to Cruz in the end, that was hard to say. Brando took the notebook from Falern's hand and casually flipped through it, then looked up at the entire convoy and said softly, "Then let's go, we'll see you in Cruz." At the end, he added in a low voice, "Holy War. Holy War, here I come. I hope that everyone can spend as much as they can on the monthly votes as they can, so that they can get the inspiration and motivation to write." Chapter 902. It was the last few days of the month of frost, and the weather outside was so cold that it made one's teeth chatter. The deciduous forests around Maxen and Schaflund couldn't escape the bleak scene. The trees were starting to become bare, and a thick layer of withered leaves had fallen on the ground since late autumn. It was as if a gray carpet had been laid out in layers between the trees. There were even a few light snowfalls in the northern regions. Although it wasn't to the extent of being covered in snow, it was at least an omen of winter in the year of the sword. This was the worst month of the year to start a war, but the Holy War just had to start at this time. History was always so unreasonable, and sometimes it was even more whimsical than the stories described. In Abes, only the black pine forest outside the Baron's castle was still tall and green in the midst of the solemn atmosphere of war. However, there was a faint black color between the canopy of the trees, as if the entire shade of the trees was a ghost hovering overhead. When the cold wind whistled past the tips of the pine trees, it made a strange whistling sound that made one's hair stand on end. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. The guests of Trondheim were stomping their feet and rubbing their hands as they complained about the horrible weather. Most of them were dressed in bright clothes and had the air of a big city. They didn't look like locals at all. A dozen or so carriages were parked outside the courtyard, their bodies painted with all kinds of emblems. Each one represented the glorious history of a family. These nobles came from all over the Erewhon, and most of them were here for the first time in Tonajol. They were here for only one purpose: to go on a diplomatic mission to the Cruz Empire. It was also a rare time for Abe's castle to be lively, although it didn't matter if the owner was willing to receive these guests. Although Brando was nominally the head of the diplomatic mission to the Cruz Empire, and he could choose any members to accompany him, an ancient tradition dictated that there must be some fixed seats in the diplomatic mission, and these seats were those that Brando couldn't specify. Among them, there was one representative of the royal family, and Prince Heruz would represent the House of Corvado. In addition, he could also choose 2 maids, an attendant, and an accompanying knight. The original list included Madame Windsor and Madame Sigma, the 2 wet nurses of His Royal Highness when he was in Winterclaw Castle. However, Heruz asked Brando to replace Madame Windsor with Medusa Lysimachia at the last minute, which made Brando wonder if the prince had reached the age of love. As for his attendant, he was a young man from Corvado, whom Brando had never heard of before. He must be a member of the royal family, and the accompanying knight was naturally the most trusted candidate of Her Royal Highness Maynard. In addition to the Corvado royal family, according to the agreement of the Holy Cathedral, the former royal family of Erewhon, the Cipher royal family should also send a representative. However, this representative naturally couldn't travel thousands of miles across Ampere Seal for a week or 2 to meet them here. The princess brother had already sent a letter to tell them that he had chosen a candidate. The envoy and his entourage would meet them in Grey Mountain, so his sister and the count didn't have to worry too much. Then came the 4 dukes, Viro, Grinoires, Lantanailan, and Karsuk, and the 3 counts, Janalasup, Yenbao, and Greymont, with the Marquis of Balta, each with a representative. Originally, there should have been a representative of Erech and Radnor, but now these 2 territories had been removed and became part of the royal family's territory in Tonajol. The Erech family was few in number, and after the Battle of Ampere Seal, they were basically wiped out. Count Radnor and his family were still eating prison food in Mageddon's dungeon, so it was naturally impossible for them to send a representative. Among the 4 dukes, Duke Viro directly sent his youngest daughter, Duke Talanlan's envoy, Duke Eek, and Duke Karsuk sent a meatball, who was said to be his second son. As for Duke Grinoires, he also sent a daughter, but she was only a little girl of 7 or 8 years old. Count Janalasu was a believer of the Silver Lion Association. He did not have a wife, so naturally, he did not have any children. He sent a sergeant whom he thought highly of, a very energetic young man. The envoy of the Grey Mountain did not come to Tonajol either, so naturally, he was waiting with the envoy of Cipher to meet them in Grey Mountain. In the end, there was a small twist in the choice of Count Yenbao's envoy, because there was no news of Count Yenbao for a long time. In the middle of the month of Frost, Baron Dahl sent an envoy himself, but he was directly driven away by the angry princess. In the end, Dilfari decided to personally serve as Yenbao's envoy. Firstly, she could leave an impression on the future successor of Yenbao in the Holy Cathedral of Fire, and secondly, she could thwart Baron Dahl's conspiracy. Brando considered her physical condition and specially prepared a larger carriage for her. Most of these nobles had their own attendants, ranging from 1 to 3. Thus, when added together, it was a bloated group of 20 or so people and 5 or 6 carriages. However, if one thought that this group was large enough, then one would be gravely mistaken. Brando soon found that there were some unexpected guests in this team. One of them was Princess Magadol. As the Princess of Antiburo, she naturally had to represent her duchy to Cruz. Originally, the Empire thought that she had died in the war in Ampere Seal, so the order was also passed to the duchy, hoping that the duchy could send another envoy to Cruz. But this news somehow reached the ears of the nun princess, and after she heard the news, she insisted on being the envoy of Antiburo to the Empire. She also privately communicated with the Antiburo royal family, so Brando naturally could not stop her. After all, the princess was recuperating in Tonajol, not under house arrest, so he had no reason to restrict her freedom to contact the outside world. And another uninvited guest was now in front of Brando. At this moment, Brando was staring at the merchant lady in front of him, who was wearing a thick fur coat, boots, gloves, a scarf, and a bearskin hat. Her small face was almost only revealing a pair of black eyes. He looked at the large suitcase in her small hands, and finally couldn't help but ask, "Well, now can you tell me, what are you planning to do here?" "Go to the Empire with Brando. I haven't been there yet." The little Roman raised her chin, revealing her small mouth from under the scarf, and answered matter-of-factly. Brando rolled his eyes. "Of course I know that, but I already said that there are no more places for the diplomatic group. Also, you don't seem to remember, I told you to stay in Tonajul obediently, and leave yourself in a safer place. Don't make me worry, understand?" He couldn't help but facepalm. This girl clearly promised him yesterday that there were no more places for the diplomatic group, and told him to stay in the territory obediently and support Amandina. She clearly promised that she would never take up a place in the diplomatic group. Wait, Brando suddenly froze in place, then reacted and glared at the young lady. "Oh, damn it, you're playing word games with me again." "Nope," the little Roman blew a white breath on her hand, and answered with a smile, "I'm perfectly justified." "Justified my ass." Brando pinched her face. "Listen to me obediently, stay in Tonajul, you're not allowed to go anywhere." Brando pinched the merchant girl's face for a while, but seeing her waving her hands and trying to break free from his hand, he couldn't help but feel a little suspicious. This was not in line with the young lady's temperament. He couldn't help but let go, and asked doubtfully, "All right, tell me, why are you going to the Empire?" The little Roman rubbed her red cheeks, and showed a fierce look. "I've been invited by the Holy Cathedral of Fire, as the president of the Seven Seas Merchant Guild, and as a distinguished guest of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, I'm going to the Cruz Empire to participate in the ceremony of the Holy War." She deliberately emphasized the word distinguished guest, and then handed the invitation to Brando. Brando opened the parchment letter, and almost blacked out and fell to the ground. The Holy Cathedral of Fire did invite some famous businessmen, poets, and even artists and scholars of various fields to participate in the annual large-scale celebration, or in commemoration of the opening of the Holy War, but he never dreamed that the Roman would be on the list, his somewhat muddle-headed and unreliable fiancé. He couldn't help but read the letter several times, and finally confirmed that the magic wax seal on the letter was the real emblem of the Holy Cathedral. After confirming that there was no mistake, he had to admit that this thing didn't look fake. He raised his head and looked at the Roman as if he was looking at an alien. "When did your business become so big?" "Very long ago. The Holy Cathedral of Fire invited me to the Harvest Festival this year, but at that time they were going to amp your seal. I've already been there, so I don't want to go anymore. It's not fun at all." The little Roman replied casually, as if the invitation from the Holy Cathedral of Fire was just an invitation for her to go on a trip, and whether she would go or not depended on her mood. Brando almost knelt down to her. The Holy Cathedral of Fire's tradition of inviting celebrities had always existed in the game. At that time, there were some famous merchant guilds among the players in Erewhon. Until the Second Era, these merchant guilds with major sponsors behind them would often break their heads over such an invitation letter. There were even a few instances where it almost led to a war between the merchant guilds. At least, Brando had seen it happen a few times. Brando carefully looked at his almighty fiancée, and felt that there must be something like Martha's daughter behind this. But in the end, it was Amandina who cleared his doubts. It turned out that many of the resources produced in the Black Forest, including some precious magic materials and magic crystals, were strategic resources that the Holy Cathedral of Fire urgently needed, especially during the period before the start of the Holy War. Tonajul's large exports in the past year had long made it an important partner in the eyes of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, so it was not surprising that the Roman, the nominal president of the Seven Seas Merchant Guild, was valued by the Holy Cathedral. But Brando shook his head. still thinking that Amandina had used a cheat. One must know that to become a merchant that could trade with the Holy Cathedral of Fire, it was not only enough to have a supply of goods, but also required a considerable network of contacts. He did not have to think to guess that the Roman must have used the connections of the merchant guilds in Ampere Seal. But as for how she did it, it was a bit ridiculous. Because this could only be explained by a miracle in Amandina's opinion. "Can I go now, Brando?" The little Roman covered her face and asked pitifully, but there was clearly a little pride in her voice. "Up to you, Brando replied in a bad mood. He felt that in front of this little fiancé, his intelligence and sense of existence as a count had been severely devalued, and this made him feel very hurt. "Then Brando, help me prepare a carriage. I want the one I usually use, and there's a stove on it that can put charcoal." "No, go to my carriage obediently." "Oh." After sending away the Roman lady and the second son of Duke Karsuk, who was almost the same height and width, who had been trying to get close to him, Brando finally broke away from the group of young masters and ladies. He walked to the side of the carriage and just happened to see Ferlin coming out of the castle with a notebook in her hand. He saw the elder of the wild elf sisters and knew that the things she had prepared were probably done. He hurriedly greeted her. "Ferlin." "My lord. Are Brunhilde and the others ready?" The elder of the wild elf sisters nodded. "Very good." Brendel finally let out a sigh of relief in his heart. This trip was not really to bring these young ladies and young masters out for a vacation, it was just a pretense on the surface. Moreover, Princess Griffine had appointed him as the leader of the envoy group and the commander of the Southern Legion. This appointment had arrived earlier, and it was obvious that she wanted him to transfer the elites from Tonajol to form the accompanying guards for this envoy group. This was a tradition that had been tacitly agreed upon. Before the start of the Holy War, the Empire had summoned the envoys of the various kingdoms and duchies. This had become a tradition since the First Holy War. Today, this was not only a way for the Holy Cathedral of Fire to confirm the confidence of the participants, but also a way for the vassal states to compete with each other to obtain a higher status in the Holy Cathedral of Fire. In this envoy group, first of all, the noble families had to greet the representatives of the Empire. This in itself represented a kind of respectful submission, and was also a way for the vassal states to pledge their loyalty to the Holy Cathedral. Of course, this kind of greeting was not so blatant and was a little more reserved. On the other hand, there was the accompanying guards of the envoy group. After all, the Holy War was a war, and every country needed to show their strength to the Holy Cathedral of Fire to obtain a corresponding status in the war and even after. The guards of the envoy group were a means of showing off. Generally speaking, the guards of the envoy group were the most elite forces of each country, representing the highest standard of the duchies and kingdoms, and also the face of the nobles and the royal family. In order to maintain this face and glory, these guards of the envoy group would even compete with each other in the Cruz Empire and clash with each other. Of course, this kind of conflict rarely led to bloodshed, but the side that lost face most of the time would not have a good time after returning to their country. The most powerful guard group of the envoy group in all the previous holy wars should be from the Black Raven Duchy in the west of the empire. This duchy was adjacent to the Hazel people and the Holy Cathedral of Earth. Although the duchy accepted the faith of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, most of the inhabitants were half-orcs and half-beastmen, and the people were very valiant, and the nobles were also very martial. At that time, they sent out a guard group composed of bear warriors, and whether it was in terms of quantity or quality, they crushed the guards of the other countries. Unfortunately, they met the Eruan people of that era. In that holy war, the envoy group sent out by the Eruan people could be regarded as the most shabby one in all the previous holy wars. Other than the nobles' representatives, the envoy group was made up of the officers of the White Lion Legion, and there were less than 20 people in total. However, the problem was that the captain of this group of 20 people was the Earth Sword Saint Darius, and the vice-captain was the scholar of the Mithril Fortress, Tolman. These two people swept away everyone, including the people of Cruz. As for how Brando's famous grandfather later became the Marshal of the Allied forces, that was another story. The envoy group was the face of Erewhon, and Tonajel was now the strongest territory in the entire Erewhon Empire. Therefore, when the princess chose Brando as the leader of the envoy group, although the royal faction had objections, they did not dare to oppose too much. As for Brando and Her Royal Highness, the two of them had reached a tacit understanding, and they used this as an excuse to brazenly stuff people into this so-called guard group. As for what these people would do in cruise in the end, that was hard to say. Brando took the notebook from Falern's hand, and casually flipped through it, then looked up at the entire convoy and said softly, "Then let's go, we'll see you in cruise." Finally, he added in a low voice, "Holy War. Holy War, here I come. P.S. You promised to be the second update, and by the way, ask for next month's monthly votes, students. Also, vote for Blackie and help him keep the 6th place in the classification." Chapter 904. When Brando first set foot on the land of the Grey Mountains, he had a very real feeling in his heart. Why, in Mervaslit, the mountains were like fangs piercing into the sky. The mountain people used their language to describe the mountains in the north, and it was undoubtedly the most exquisite rhetoric for the steep and sharp peaks with grey limestone cliffs. The curved and undulating mountain ridges made the distant horizon look equally twisted. Above them was the light grey sky, and below them was the vast and endless valley. The sun poured down on the cliffs on the other side of the valley, and similarly carved the shadow of the mountain they were on. Far away in the mountain stream, some unknown bird of prey was circling, occasionally letting out a sharp howl that echoed between the mountains. The young prince whispered to them that it was a grey falcon, a bird of prey that only lived in the Grey Mountains. Only then did Brando remember that this place was very close to Haru's hometown. If one could look past the vast mountains, one would be able to see the lowlands where the people of Beale had lived for generations, and the vast plains to the north. On the plains, there were scattered hills and black pine forests, and there was also a huge capital. He asked the young prince if he had chosen this path when he escaped, and the young prince said yes. But at that time, they left in a carriage under the cover of night. Entering the Grey Mountains in the dark of night, he felt uneasy. The pitch-black mountains were like sleeping beasts, and it left a deep impression on him. But now that he was with his teacher, he naturally did not have to be afraid anymore. The young prince's words made everyone laugh. In addition to Brando and the Roman, there was also Magadal, Dilfari, and Maynard. The nun princess and the countess were the original owners of this carriage, while the merchant lady and the young prince squeezed in. It was not that the young lady did not have her own carriage, but Dilfari's carriage had a special charcoal brazier, so the sneaky young lady thought of this from the beginning and tried to coax the soft-hearted countess to invite them into the carriage. Fortunately, the countess did not mind at all. She was more than happy to have a few more people to chat with. The young Roman chattered and had endless stories, most of which were made up, which was to Dilfari's liking. Thus, the two of them became good friends in no time. Only Princess Magadal stood by the side and listened with a slight smile, as if she had no intention of getting involved in the conversation. She only spoke occasionally when asked, but every word she said was meaningful, showing the demeanor of the nun princess of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. The carriage rolled on for a while, and there was a knock on the carriage door. Brando opened the door, and a gust of cold wind blew in from the outside, causing the temperature in the carriage to drop by a few degrees. Of course, Maynard was an exception. The female knight sat beside Harouz with her hands on the brass hilt of her sword, her long eyelashes drooping as she counted the tassels on the carriage's curtain. Yuda's weathered face appeared outside the carriage door. The former female mercenary leader and current captain of the White Lion Guards was sitting on horseback, parallel to the carriage. When she saw Brando open the door, she bowed slightly and said to him, "My lord, Fort Tisco is in front." "So we've already arrived." Brando asked the carriage to slow down, then jumped off and closed the door. As soon as he set foot on the land of the Grey Mountain, he suddenly felt a sense of reality. This was the first time since he came to this world that he had crossed Ampere Seal and come to the land of the north. He seemed to remember the scene of running and fighting with everyone on this land. He couldn't help but subconsciously look back at the carriage, but through the foggy window, he couldn't see the expression on the face behind the window. At this time, the female mercenary leader had already brought him a warhorse from behind. He silently took the reins from Yuta's hand, flipped onto the horse, and then asked casually, "How is it? Are you used to the land of the north?" Yuta was a little surprised by the way her lord spoke like a master. She wiped the frost on her eyebrows, shook her head, and said with a somewhat amused tone, "My lord, I'm more familiar with this land than you are." Brando was slightly stunned, and looked back at his subordinate, as if he just remembered that he had never asked about their origins. "You're from the Grey Mountain? You can say that. Before my sister's accident, we lived in Corvado for a period of time. Sigh, that experience made me hate the nobles to the core. Sometimes I think that if only I woke up earlier. But forget it, I don't want to talk about these things anymore." Yuta suddenly sighed, looking at the undulating mountains with waning interest. Brando nodded and did not ask any more questions. Yuta was the leader of his guards, but she was not the best choice. The most suitable person was actually Koden, but the old man was determined not to interfere in Tanajal's affairs anymore. After Count Ranner was imprisoned, he bought a piece of land near Menta, as if he was determined to be a carefree manor owner or an old farmer. However, Koden still recommended Yuta to him. Out of the 5 mercenary leaders under him, Reto deliberately distanced himself from the core of power in Abes, and only wanted the refugees from Fortress Reden to live a better life. Karglais and the others privately called him the leader of the refugees, and the Red-Beard Badam was infatuated with local law and order, as if he was satisfied with just being a magistrate. He once admitted that he did not have any great ambitions, and his current life was already his goal. Brando did not intend to force these 2 mercenary leaders to follow him since the beginning. Besides, he knew that Badam's abilities were limited, and being a magistrate was already the best he could do. The other 3 mercenary leaders who joined later were even more ambitious. Cornelius became Amandina's subordinate and was responsible for the logistics of the territory's army. Rabin had already made a name for himself in the White Lion Guards, and his military experience in the Karsuk Highlands made him the most comfortable in Brando's army. After the Autumn-Twilight War, he became another important assistant to Karglais. Karglais intended to let him command a cavalry unit, but the unit had not been formed yet. Only Yuta's vision seemed to be limited by her experience as a mercenary leader. She was considered outstanding when she was a mercenary leader, but after joining the White Lion Guards, her performance was very ordinary. Amandina appreciated the experience and loyalty of these mercenary leaders, and wanted to give them a better position. Rabin and Cornelius were able to accept it, but Yuta's position was awkward. She did not want to rely on her relationship with Amandina to climb up the ranks, so she was only a small infantry leader in the White Lion Guards. When he received the mission and wanted to find a commander who was capable of commanding a small group, Jana immediately entered his sights. Koden had also suggested that Jana's experience would be extremely useful in commanding a mercenary group that was made up of multiple professions and different types of soldiers. Of course, he actually had a better choice, and that was Freya. However, it was a waste of talent to let Freya be the leader of the diplomatic group. More importantly, she had just gained some reputation in the kingdom, and now she needed to stay and strengthen her position in the southern army. On the other hand, he and Maynard were going to the Empire, and the princess needed a loyal general by her side. Freya stayed in Erewhon to partner with Amandina, Karglais, and Cohen, who was far away in Silman, so he could be more assured of the situation in the south. Even if the old nobles wanted to use this opportunity to stir up trouble, the princess and Tanajul would not be in immediate danger. Furthermore, he left behind the Tree Elves and the White Lion Guards, so that Freya would have enough military power to use. Because of this consideration, he finally chose Yuta, and was very satisfied with her performance. In this diplomatic group, he brought along Medisha, the Shire, Hippamra, the Nightsong Tigers mercenary group, the White Lion Guards that belonged to Mars, a few hundred steel golems, a few flying gargoyles, a few witches, 4 valkyries, and a lady who could not be seen in public. She used her experience to arrange these different people, different soldiers, and different war machines well. In addition to the White Lion Guards and the Nightsong Tigers mercenary group, Brando hoped that the steel golems and gargoyles provided by the Buga people could be hidden, and of course, the witches and valkyries should not be seen in public. Yuta divided the troops into 2 groups and specially designed a marching route for them. She was very experienced in how to travel in the mountains and not get lost. Many of the routes she designed were used by Brando in the game in his previous life, and Brando was full of praise for them. After more than a week of travel, Brando could completely confirm that it was a waste of talent to let this lady be an infantry leader. Some people were born to be mercenary leaders, elite division commanders, and Yuta was no doubt such a talent. Then Brando looked up at the long line of people on the narrow mountain road. It was mainly made up of 5 carriages. The first carriage in front carried the envoys of Count Eek and Count Janalesu, the second carriage carried the meatball son of Duke Karsuk, the third carriage carried the daughter of Duke Viro and the 7 or 8-year-old little girl of the Grenoir's family, and the fourth carriage was the carriage of a certain merchant lady. These carriages were all accompanied by several attendants, and the White Lion Guards, which made the originally narrow mountain road very congested. This was because Brando had wisely placed the hundreds of envoys at the back of the convoy, leaving only a small group of cavalry in front to open the road. Otherwise, they would have blocked the mountain road and would not be able to move. In front of this bloated group, the shadow of a wall had appeared. This wall stretched across the mountain road, and one side of the dark tower was close to the steep mountain wall, and the other side seemed to be hanging over a deep cliff. From afar, it was awe-inspiring. This was Fort Tisco, the most important pass from Cipher to Corvado. Brando had been here a few times in the game in his previous life, but because of the presence of players, the atmosphere of the fort in the game was not as solemn as it was in the game. It was much livelier, and he remembered that there was a spontaneous market formed by players on this mountain road. He led Yuta forward through the crowd until they came to the bottom of the wall. Medisha and the Shire were already waiting for them, and there was also the meatball son of Duke Karsuk, who looked like he was rolling on the ground. After so many days, Brando had figured out how to pronounce this guy's awkward name, Avram or Auguste. When Avram saw Brando, he could not help but complain loudly to him, saying that this remote place was full of ignorant country bumpkins who insisted on seeing the Count in person, and that they did not give him any face at all. Brando had long been immune to this level of complaint, but he still had some doubts in his heart. Generally speaking, these soldiers would not easily offend nobles. After all, in this era, there were not many who dared to pretend to be nobles. According to Avram, either someone was deliberately making things difficult for them, or something had happened in the fort. He cast a questioning look at Medisha and the Shire. The little elven princess frowned and replied softly, "Judging from their tone, it seems like there's a thief in the fort. There are not only soldiers and officers in this fortress, but there are also their families and villagers living nearby. It's not like this place is too big or too small. It's not like there are only soldiers and officers in this fortress. There are also their families and villagers living nearby. It's not like this place is too big or too small. If there's a burglar, then this place has to be guarded for 365 days in a year, and 24 hours a day." However, the Shire was obviously more familiar with the ways of the world. He hurriedly explained with a smile, "My lord, I've asked. I'm afraid that Mr. Avram has misunderstood something. I heard that the thief stole something from the owner of this place. That's why the situation is like this." Brando finally understood. A nobleman, especially a military one, was actually patronized by a thief in his own territory. Anyone would be furious if they were in his place. Although in many of Erewhon's village stories, stories about the thief of God and the nightingale were exaggerated to the extreme, and these incarnations of justice seemed to be specifically targeting the nobles. They were chivalrous, and they robbed the rich to help the poor. But in fact, those who really understood this business would understand that most of these gray areas that made a living in a certain place were actually inextricably linked to the nobles. This was not to say that the nobles secretly supported these people's work, but it was precisely to protect the nobles' rights and interests from being infringed upon. Most of the time, the nobles were well aware of how many thieves there were in the area, and what the identity of these thieves were. Other than that, the nobles basically minded their own business. Therefore, the person who committed this crime was definitely an outsider. But Brando was curious, and he wondered who was so daring. Soon, the guards verified their identities, lowered the drawbridge, and opened the gate, allowing them to enter the fortress. Brando stared at the slowly rising gate, and he knew that the so-called identity verification was just a pretense. Most of the time before this was just a report to the Viscount. The guards below were unwilling to bear the responsibility, so they asked the Viscount to personally let them pass. But what Brando did not know was that the daring bandit he muttered was really a local, and not an outsider. Inside Castle Tisco, 2 carriages were parked under the shade of a tree. Although the so-called shade was only left with a few lonely withered leaves, they still hadn't fallen to the ground. Outside the carriages, there were many servants. At first glance, these servants didn't look like those who came from the countryside. Although they looked bright and clean, they looked lazy at first glance, as if they still had the habit of idling around before they became noble servants. These servants were well trained. Their masters did not open the door to get down from the carriage, so they stood in 2 rows in front of the carriages. They did not say a word and looked straight ahead, like 2 rows of puppets that were about to take root on the ground. As for the 2 carriages, the emblem on one had been removed, and the coat of arms on the other was a black wolf. In fact, the wolf emblem alone was enough to stop anyone in Castle Tisk, because it was the emblem of the Grey Mountain family. 2 young people were sitting in the carriage. To be exact, 2 young ladies. One was a 17 or 18 years old noble lady, and the other was a young girl with curly hair under a huge scholar's hat and thick glasses, like an old pedant. However, she was very short, like a dwarf, and even her breasts had not started to develop. At first glance, it was obvious that she was a real loli, and judging from her age, she seemed to be no more than 11 or 12 years old. The 2 were obviously talking, but what was surprising was that the one who led the conversation was the little girl who looked like she had not even changed her teeth yet. She said, so slow, I hate people who are not punctual." The noble lady was obviously worried, and asked carefully, "Chiara, they seem to have found something missing." "Of course they will find it," the loli replied matter-of-factly, "that Viscount is not an idiot." "But won't we get into trouble?" "Troublesome? Of course not." Chiara spun a card-like object in her hand and looked at it with interest. "I'm just a little interested in this thing. Would he dare to disobey me if I asked him to give it to me? I just don't want to owe him a favor, so I had to do it myself. Besides, things like mistakes and whatnot have not appeared in my dictionary." Chapter 905. While the 2 were talking, a servant knocked on the carriage door and reported, "Miss, the envoy group has arrived." They entered the city from the Stone Lizard Mountain path. They were delayed for a while because of the martial law. "Humph." The little girl knocked on the table in the middle of the carriage and said, "It seems that Guy has arrived." "Chiara, should we go?" the Count's daughter asked softly, but the little girl's attitude was firm. She quickly shook her head and said, "No, we will wait here. Let me see if that Guy is boring." Although the Count's daughter had a gentle look on her face, she was no fool. She could naturally tell that her companion was deliberately making things difficult for the Count. She could also vaguely guess the reason, and could not help but ask more worriedly, Kiara, this isn't very good. Why is it not good? The little girl pretended to be indifferent. But he is the leader of the envoy group after all, so what? If that guy dares to scold me with a straight face, I won't go to the Empire. The little girl was very dissatisfied. You won't go to the Empire? The Count's daughter showed a shocked expression. What are you afraid of, Enid? When the time comes, you can stay at my house for a while. I will complain to my brother. Your father won't dare to do anything to us. The little girl replied. The Count's daughter opened her mouth and wanted to say something, but she knew that she could not persuade her companion. She could only sit there uneasily as if she had accepted her fate. The carriage was quiet for a while. The two people each had different feelings as they waited for Brando's arrival. The Count's daughter only hoped that the Count would not vent his anger on her. She was worried about her gains and losses and could not help but be worried for a while. The little girl sitting opposite her did not seem to care. She gently tapped the window with her finger while looking at the scenery outside. After Brando entered the city, he received a message from a servant. He already knew that the representatives of House Cypher and Count Grey Mountain were already in the city. However, he first arranged for the diplomatic group to stay in an inn in the fortress before heading to the appointed location alone. When he arrived at the agreed location, he saw the two carriages parked under the oak tree from afar, as well as 2 rows of servants standing beside the carriages. He walked over and revealed his identity to these people, thinking that he would be able to see the 2 representatives. However, he did not expect that the servant who passed on the message would walk back the way he came not long after he reached the carriages, bringing back a message with a poker face. The young lady heard that the Count is knowledgeable. In order to prove the Count's identity, she wants to test some of the Count's knowledge. Brando couldn't help but be stunned. Was there something wrong with this noble lady's head? How could she verify one's identity like this? Could it be that the princess's royal ring was fake? He glanced at the carriage and thought to himself, forget it. After all, she is a member of the royal family, even though she is a former royal family, and she is a girl. It's not good to be too calculative. He could only answer patiently, please speak. Chiara's little face was almost pressed against the window. She said with a little pride, I have long heard that the guy boasted of being knowledgeable. The rumors about him in the Southern Territory are amazing. I have seen a lot of people like him. It's just a golden exterior. To them, knowledge is just a disguise and gorgeous clothes. Let me expose his hypocritical appearance. I will let him understand that the search for the truth is sacred and cannot be profaned. The Count's daughter could almost see herself being punished for bringing trouble to her family. The small house where she was confined swayed in front of her. She asked worriedly, what questions did you ask him, Chiara? Hee, the little girl smiled slyly. She pushed her thick glasses and replied with some pride, nothing, just some ancient words. Enid stared at her suspiciously. She wondered if her companion would really be so soft-hearted. Sure enough, the little girl said, but these words were found on some stone slabs by a friend of my teacher. In order to unearth those stone slabs, my teacher and I stayed in the cold and boring Balta Plateau for a long time. My teacher is an authority in the field of ancient languages, but even he couldn't recognize all the words on those stone slabs. Just wait and see how that guy embarrasses himself. Enid knew who the little girl's teacher was. She thought that since even the master couldn't recognize all the slabs, it wouldn't be embarrassing even if the Count couldn't recognize them. Of course, she didn't dare to say this out loud, in case the young lady changed her mind at the last minute. Outside the carriage, Brando was taking a piece of paper from the servant. He glanced at the tadpole-like ancient words on the paper and couldn't help but laugh. Isn't this the content of the ancient stone slabs? The first clue of the war slate, these stone slabs were the clues he provided to Tolman, which allowed people to unearth them in advance in this era. It was fine if it was something else, but it just had to be the words on the stone slabs. The words on the stone slabs were once a hot topic on the forum. In the end, it was translated by a level 16 ancient language master in their guild who wore a +3 language skill divine artifact, Necklace of Knowledge. He could even recite it with his eyes closed. He put down the paper and without even thinking, he said to the servant in front of him, "Tell your mistress that the fragments of the sky fell to the ground with the collapse of the towering pillars." It recorded the whispers in the dust and wind. A few minutes later, "Kiera, did the Count guess correctly?" Enid looked at her companion worriedly. She had been staring at the contents of the paper for a long time without moving. "He didn't guess." The little girl dropped this sentence and jumped out of the carriage. She pushed away the servant who came to support her and hurriedly ran out. Brando didn't expect that the person who came out of the carriage would be such a little girl who seemed to still be in the process of growing her teeth. In standard villain lines, she was a little girl with yellow hair who was still wet behind the ears. The other party was wearing a pair of thick bottle-bottomed glasses that didn't match her cute face. She looked at him with a frown and asked, "Hey, how did you recognize these words? Does she still care about aristocratic etiquette?" "This little lady, may I ask who you are?" Brando was a little unhappy at first, but when he found that the person who tested him was such a little girl, he was no longer angry. No matter how bored he was, he wouldn't be so bored as to argue with a child. Kiera seemed to have realized her rudeness at this time, but she snorted softly and replied, "Count Digiu is my father, Queen Anna is my aunt, my brother is Levin Ornesson. Duke Cypher, you should know who I am by now, right? What kind of messy relationship is this?" Brando looked at the arrogant little girl for a while before he sorted out his thoughts and asked, "You are the representative of House Cypher?" "It's the former royal family," the little girl corrected, "more or less, but I don't want to go to the Empire. Can you persuade me?" What a spoiled little girl, Brando thought to himself. He shook his head and said, "I can't persuade you. How about this, you go back first. The eldest son of the king is a generous person, he probably won't blame his sister." You're really strange, you actually call my brother the eldest son of the king. It's not proper for you to call him that, you know. Aren't you afraid that the princess will cause trouble for you?" "Oh, I know," the little girl's eyes flashed, and she replied proudly, "You don't care about that little princess at all, right? How about you support Levin to take the throne? The House of Clovardo has already lost its sword, so it's natural for it to lose the throne. History is a cycle, and the House of Cypher is already at the time of its revival. Besides, my brother is much more powerful than that princess of yours. That little princess only knows how to sell herself for a good price, marry a good husband, and revive the House of Clovardo. She's very superficial. The revival of a country can't be decided by just one family. How about it, I promise you that in the future, you won't just be a count, but people will call you a duke." If it was someone else who said those words to Brendel would have definitely punched that person to the ground, unable to get up. But it was a little lowly with a childish voice who was advising him in such a serious manner, he did not know whether to laugh or cry. This little girl had not even changed all her teeth, but she kept calling Griffin a little lass, as if Griffin, who was already 17 years old, was still wet behind the ears in her eyes. "Miss, if you don't want to go to the Empire, I can write a letter for you to prove that you're not feeling well. As for the rest, I'm really not interested in discussing it." Brando could only answer like this. But the little girl didn't seem to appreciate it. She shook her head and said, "I'm fine. I don't need you to write a letter for me. Besides, you haven't told me why you can read those words. I must find a way to figure it out." "All right, as you wish." Brando shook his head. "Didn't you say that you don't want to go to the Empire? How can you go back on your words?" But Chiara seemed to see the disapproving look on his face. She snorted softly and said, "I don't want to go to the Empire, and I want to go to the Empire. There's no contradiction between that." After that, she turned around and ran back to the carriage. She rudely used her hands and feet to climb up the mountain and said loudly to the Count's daughter who was sitting on the carriage, "Enide, I've changed my mind. I'm going to the Empire. You go back alone." "No need, Chiara. I'll go with you." The Count's daughter wanted to cry but had no tears. When did she say that she wanted to go back? But Chiara's words finally made her feel relieved. Fortunately, at least she didn't have to go back home and be confined. Although she didn't know why the young lady suddenly changed her mind, the Count's daughter couldn't help but have an indescribable good impression of the Count Tonagel whom she had never met before. Thank God, Martha was above. She secretly drew a God's mark on her chest. After Chiara and the Count's daughter returned to the team, the people who had been traveling for days enjoyed a rare night in the hotel where they could sleep peacefully. Although the incident of the Viscount being burgled in the city caused an uproar, after all, it had nothing to do with them. Although the guards probably couldn't wait to arrest all the merchants who had some assets in the city and then claim that they had cooperated to commit the crime, and then confiscate their property, they didn't dare to provoke this team with a strong background. The delegation stayed in Fort Tisco for half a day and a night, and set off early the next morning. It was said that the Viscount didn't find the mysterious burglar until the end, so the area around the Grey Mountain was filled with the legend of a mysterious nightingale for a long time. At first, the image of this nightingale was like that of a god in the sky, but later, no one knew how she got involved with the Count of Tonagel. Some people even swore that they saw the Count steal the Viscount's things with their own eyes, as if he was there when Brando was committing the crime. Over time, the image of this nightingale gradually spread to the image of a wise and astute little girl, but no matter which image it was, what they did was to rob the rich to help the poor, as if they couldn't find anything more meaningful to do every day, regardless of whether they had enough to eat every day. As for the things that the Viscount lost, there were many different opinions. Some said that it was a ton of gold, or a diamond the size of a fist. Some exaggerated said that it was evidence of the Viscount's treason with the enemy. Most of the people who harbored such malicious thoughts had some kind of enmity with the Viscount, but there was a general consensus that these things, if only they could get their hands on them, how good would that be? As it turned out, most people did not have the noble character to be a hero. After leaving Fort Tisco, the diplomatic group headed north, but they did not enter Corvado. Instead, they crossed the border between the Grey Mountain and the Balta Plateau, braving the biting cold wind of the Iron Thorn Mountain Road as they approached the kingdom's border day after day. After leaving the Grey Mountain area, there were endless mountains. There were no longer any human settlements in the vast rolling mountains. 3 days later, they passed by the vicinity of Winterclaw Fort. It could be said that they had bid farewell to the last area closest to civilization before reaching the Empire. After that was the snowy region that no one set foot in all year round, a natural forbidden zone between the Empire and the kingdom. Peruz told them some terrible legends about this region, such as the soft sounds in the wind at night were the whispers of the undead on the plateau, and the terrible wolf-like creatures on the plateau. He and his sister had lived in Winterclaw Fort for quite a long time, so he knew some of the local folklore very well. However, these stories scared the ladies in the diplomatic groups so much that they did not sleep well for a few nights. After that, Brando and the young prince became unwelcome guests in each carriage. For Brando, it was an unexpected disaster. These days, Chiara had been pestering Brando to find out why he knew the meaning of the ancient words. Of course, Brando could not come up with a lie like, "If you are all cavemen, then I am at least a Homo sapiens from the future." However, during a casual conversation, when the little girl from House Cypher asked about his master, he, as usual, used the excuse that he learned from the Bugis. Unexpectedly, this excuse worked wonders. After that, Chiara disappeared and hid in his carriage with the Count's daughter all day long. It was only later that Brando found out that she was plotting how to steal the knowledge of the Bugas from him. This so-called truth made him want to cry, but no tears came out. The others in the diplomatic group were not as hard-working as the eldest daughter of House Cypher. Except for Iko and the sergeant from Janalesu, most of the noble descendants who lived like princes began to complain since they entered Balta. Then, they began to fall ill one after another. The first one was the meatball, Mr. Ephraim. Because he was greedy for some unclean game, of course, he asked his servant to find a way to find it. He began to vomit and have diarrhea. Fortunately, there were still clerics in the diplomatic group who took a day or two to calm him down. Then, it was the 7 or 8-year-old little girl from Duke Grenoire's family who had a high fever. In the end, Brando, the leader, seemed to have played the role of a nanny. Although it sounded good to let the little girl hold his hand and call him brother with teary eyes, the price was that he did not sleep well for a few days. After the diplomatic group crossed the last mountain on the border of Balta, everything seemed to have quieted down involuntarily. Because everyone knew that the fortress of the Black Sword was in front of them. Since the beginning of the last era, that was the gateway to the empire, the last checkpoint in the north of the kingdom. Majestic mountains traversed the north and south, connecting the two kingdoms together. In the southeast of the empire, there was a huge mountain range, part of the White Mountain Range. This mountain range traversed the entire southern part of Saint Ausol. At the end of the west, it crossed the southernmost part of the wilderness of the Four Territories, forming an undulating mountain range. In the center of the mountain range, there was snow all year round, and there were even many large and small black forests. This was a paradise for archaeologists and explorers. The Dirut Mountains were named after the first Wind Elf king. To the west of the mountains was the famous Anzaruta region. This name alone may be confusing, but it had another name, the home of the Highlanders, the home of the Long Blade Lords. To the east of the Dirut Mountains was the starry Abyssal Sea. Along the coast of the Abyssal Sea were duchies and kingdoms of various sizes. Antiburo was one of them. To the north was the famous wilderness of the Four Territories, the four-leaf grass plains, the birthplace of the Wind Elves and the Cruz people. At the same time, it was also the place where the Sacred Covenant was made. The Balta Plateau was just the southern tip of this famous mountain range. The mountain range gradually leveled off in the direction of the Corvado Plains, and together with the eastern end of the Broken Sword Mountains, it formed a famous mountain pass. This was the fortress of the Black Sword. On this day, the diplomatic group finally saw the insignificant fortress between the two peaks from the high ground. But everyone knew that when you really came to the fortress, you would be deeply shocked by the wall that was more than 20 meters tall. That was the Imperial Wall. Chapter 906. In the wilderness south of Anzaruta and the border between Balta and Anzaruta, most of the undulating ridges only had this kind of dark rock. There was little vegetation, and the higher elevations were covered with white snow all year round. Below, there was only sparse Eurasian heather or similar shrubs that formed a tundra grassland, scattered on the ground like a thin layer of volcanic ash. A majestic fortress stood between the two dark mountains. The walls were more than 60 feet high and were made of square stones. The empire's flag fluttered on the 4 watchtowers. From these towering towers, one could easily monitor every valley within a radius of 10 miles. The observation room was also equipped with rotating ballistas and wizards. There was also more than a squadron of crossbowmen, who could shoot the enemy from the air through the holes in the towers. The fortress was also equipped with an air force. The Frontier Legion stationed here had griffins and wyverns, as well as elite Pegasus Knight. They would ascend to the sky as soon as possible after confirming the enemy situation, guarding the airspace above the fortress. Brando withdrew his gaze from the huge iron cages on the walls. Those were the Griffins' cages. The Griffins locked in them were the air force of the early warning unit on the walls. They could be used for reconnaissance and interception. Not far from those iron cages was a towering giant door. This giant door was more than 50 feet high from the ground to the top. It opened in the middle and was completely made of cast iron. In order to cast this iron door, the crew's craftsmen used precast iron workpieces to assemble it together. The wizards used magic to mix them together. The purpose of casting this iron door was to fully unleash the impact of the dragon cavalry inside the fortress. There were 2 regiments of dragon cavalry inside the Black Sword Fortress. When the crews needed them, they would let the dragon cavalry line up behind the door and open the main door to attack the enemy outside the fortress. The flat slope outside the Black Sword Fortress was also artificially paved. It was originally a steep valley, but it was filled up by Duke Semple and turned into what it was now. Romaine stood beside him, holding his arm tightly with her little hand. She was also looking up at the majestic wall. She slightly opened her mouth and sighed. "It's so high, Brando." The outer walls of the Black Sword Fortress were raised during the Year of Glory. Before that, the main wall was no more than 35 feet high, not much different from the outer walls of Monsteros. During the Year of Frost, the Highlanders led by the Longblade Lord attacked this place with the support of the Erwin. During the Year of the Tiger Lizard, the crews recaptured this fortress and began to rebuild it. The construction of the stronghold lasted for 30 years. It wasn't until the Year of Summer when Duke Semple completed the front ramp that the stronghold was completed. Brando explained to her. This knowledge was not rare for a veteran player, but the little Roman was stunned. She had never heard of this before, but after hearing the words of the person beside her, she felt that Brando was the most knowledgeable person in the world. She was a little proud, but also very curious. "Can someone really conquer this place, Brando? This wall is so high, can they climb it?" Even though the Black Sword Fortress isn't the strongest fortress in the Empire, it's still one of the best in the southern regions of the Empire. However, this city has indeed been attacked by Awin's people twice in history. The first time was during the war when King Eric helped the Highlanders capture Anzaruda. The second time was more recently, during the Walnut Rebellion about 100 years ago. At that time, the Highland Knights of Balta captured this fortress after repelling the invasion of the Empire. Chiara seemed to have heard the conversation between the two and snorted softly. That was the time when the Corvado dynasty was at its strongest, but unfortunately, it was still too weak. If it were me, I would not return this fortress to the Kurlots. I would either give it to the Lion Beast men or the Wind Elves so that the kingdom would not have to face the threat from the north. Brando directly turned a blind eye to the childish talk. He noticed that the other envoys were also curious about this matter. He nodded and replied, "That is indeed the case." The Black Sword Fortress was first built in the Year of Moss of the Chaos Era. It was completed at the beginning of the First Era. In history, it has only been conquered twice, and both times were accomplished by the Erwin. That is because other countries would not take a detour to attack the Empire from Erwin's territory. Chiara curled her lips and replied. The fat man, Ephraim, asked curiously, "Leader, do you mean that our Erwin actually defeated the Empire?" "What do you mean?" Brando was stunned. "What I mean is, Leader, how could Erwin defeat the Empire?" "You must be mistaken, right?" the fat man said loudly as if he had heard a funny joke. Brando was almost angered to death by his words. He replied snappily, "Why do you think that Erwin has never defeated the Empire?" He did not even have the strength to look down on this guy's ignorant historical knowledge. Let's not talk about the large and small battles in the past hundreds of years. Although the Cruz Empire was strong, they were not invincible. There were many examples of them being defeated by the Erwin. Less than 5 months ago, he had beaten the Holy Cathedral of Fire and the Empire's expeditionary fleet in Ampere Seal and taught them a lesson. Yet, this guy ignored this war. He could not help but feel depressed. He could not help but wonder what this guy, as a descendant of nobles, had learned in Karsuk. However, Ephraim was still stubborn. He spread out his hands and asked, "But the empire is so big. Erewhon is just a small country at the border. It can't even compare to a province of the empire. How can we defeat them?" "Commander, I don't believe you when you say that we, the people of Awin, have defeated the Kurluts before. There are many such examples in history. In fact, it's just a small conflict, and they claim it as a great victory. I've seen this kind of thing many times in Karsuk. My friends in the patrol team often do this kind of thing. The glory that the royal family preaches must not be fully believed. It's just to maintain the legitimacy of their rule." Comparing the patrol cavalry of this era to the Highland Knight of the War of Walnut, this idea was very avant-garde. Brando could not help but marvel at this guy's way of thinking. He could not help but answer, "In that case, why do you think we are standing here today, representing Erewhon to the Empire? The Kurlutzians would never ask their provinces to send envoys to pay tribute to His Majesty." Ephraim obviously did not consider this question. He was stunned by Brando's question and could not help but frown and think hard. At this time, Duke Viro's daughter, the 17 or 18-year-old girl, spoke up, "I think it's because the Empire doesn't need a remote place like Awin. Other than our kingdom, aren't there many other kingdoms and duchies under the Holy Cathedral of Fire, and the Empire hasn't made a move against them either. My teacher often told me that if the Empire had the heart, Erewhon would have become an autonomous region like Anzaruda. By then, we would all be nobles of the Empire. Am I right, Count?" "Yes, my foot. That damn teacher of yours better not let me meet him," Brando said in his heart. But when he looked at the expressions of the other people in the diplomatic group, he found that except for outsiders like the Roman, Medisha, and Hippamra, most of them seemed to agree with this statement. Of course, those who truly understood the history of the kingdom were excluded. For example, the Shire and Chiara, both of them had a look of disdain on their faces. What made Brando curious was that he saw a similar look on Yuta's face. At this time, Chiara finally could not hold it in anymore. After all, she was a former member of the royal family. Upholding the legitimacy of the kingdom was also upholding the reputation of her family. She coldly sneered, "The war between the Empire and the Erewhon Empire since the end of the Dragon Age was also a good show. It was so that the Erewhon Empire could become independent from the Empire and establish our own kingdom. The nobles of the Cruz Empire are rich in the spirit of helping others. They sent the late King Erewhon Empire out of the wilderness of the Four Realms. We really should thank them properly, right?" Her sharp sarcasm startled everyone. Only then did Avram realize that he had somehow offended this young lady. Duke Viro's daughter opened her mouth and finally answered, "Isn't that because the Wind Elves are helping us?" Brando saw Chiara's little face as dark as the bottom of a pot and could not help but shake his head. He did not know when the nobles of the kingdom had lost their backbone. During the era when the Highland Knight of Balta still existed, during the year of the Walnut, the Empire was never a problem for the Erewhon. The problem was whether the people of Erewhon still dared to fight. That was all. He could not help but think of Ebden. The White Knight's predecessor was a Highland Knight of Balta. Since then, for nearly 100 years, the nobles of Erewhon seemed to have suddenly lost their spirit. They could no longer raise their heads in front of the people of Cruz. But he did not expect the nobles' imagination of the Cruz Empire to be so absurd. When Avram first spoke, he thought that he was just an exception. After all, this guy looked like a scion of a rich family. He was the typical example of an ignorant and incompetent person. But when Duke Viro's daughter opened her mouth to speak, he sensed that something was wrong. Although this little girl usually behaved normally, he could tell that she was a well-educated person. She also knew a lot about foreign affairs and etiquette. She obviously knew about the history of the kingdom, but like Avram, she didn't agree with this history. There were too many differences between this history and what they saw now. He shook his head for the second time and answered his nominal subordinates, "Although the empire is strong, it is not without enemies. Although Erewhon is small, the empire cannot spare all its energy to deal with us. The empire has Fanzan in the north, Saint Hassel and Madara in the east, and Hazel and Toquinen in the west. In the face of so many enemies, it is impossible for the empire to spare the strength of a province to deal with us. Moreover, in the south, there is Anzaruda. Since the time of the Long-Blade Lord, the Highlanders have dreamed of independence for nearly 7 centuries. The empire should be thankful that we do not make trouble for them. How would they dare to make a move in the south? Therefore, the empire actually wants to maintain this relationship with us. On the one hand, they are still unwilling to acknowledge the establishment of Erewhon because of the honor of the empire. On the other hand, they are unable to really make a move in the south. Even in the War of Walnut, our opponent was only the Duke of Walnut. In the end, we were actually helping the empire to quell the rebellion. Erewhon's position is so sensitive and special that the Wind Elves and the empire do not dare to act rashly. Relying on this delicate balance, the late King Eric found his own path that belonged to Erewhon. At this point, he glanced at Chiara. Anson I has obviously understood the secret between them. That is why he returned the Black Sword Fortress to Cruz after the War of Walnut. Because once the balance is broken, it may not be a good thing for Erewhon. Brando looked at the others and said word by word, "So, Erewhon does not necessarily need to defeat the entire empire, but this does not mean that Erewhon has no chance of winning. Big countries have the power of big countries, and small countries have the wisdom of small countries. I am telling you all this because I want you to understand that the kingdom of Erewhon has its own unique advantages. Its nobles and people do not need to be enemies in front of the empire." After hearing this, Chiara could not help but snort softly. Obviously, she already knew this knowledge and did not need Brando to repeat it. As for the others, including Avram and Duke Viro's youngest daughter, most of them were hearing this for the first time, so they were skeptical. However, Brando did not need them to believe him completely. He just wanted to give these nobles a heads up in advance so that they would not lose face when they saw the empire's nobles. As the group was talking, they gradually approached the Black Sword Fortress. It was at this time that a loud noise came from the front, attracting everyone's attention. The noise started with a row of neat footsteps, followed by the sound of heavy horse hooves. Then, everyone saw a small group of Empire's soldiers appear in their field of vision. This small group of Empire's soldiers was led by 3 or 4 knights. They opened the small wooden gate beside the huge Black Sword Fortress gate, lowered the drawbridge, and rushed out. The few knights shouted and suddenly ordered their men to rush towards a caravan outside the fortress. It was worth mentioning that at this time of the year, other than Brando's eye-catching group of nobles, there were also many caravans of various sizes gathered outside the fortress. As one of the only 2 gateways between the Empire and Erewhon, the Black Sword Fortress was not only a strategic military point, but also an important transportation route between the 2 countries. Throughout the year, except for the 1 or 2 months after the winter harp month when the mountain path was completely frozen, there would be caravans passing through the fortress most of the time. At this moment, the target of the Empire's soldiers was obviously the Erewhon caravan. They quickly rushed into the middle of the caravan and first knocked down the armed guards. Then, they chased the merchants out of the caravan, tied their hands behind their backs, and pushed them to the ground. After that, the Empire's soldiers returned to the middle of the caravan and used their field swords to cut the ropes on the carriages and threw the goods on the ground one by one. Not long after, they found a lot of people from the carriages. There were men and women, old and young. The Empire's soldiers herded these people together. Most of these people were dressed in ragged clothes, shivering in the cold wind. The women and children among them were so scared that they cried loudly. However, the Empire's soldiers were still indifferent, and a few of them even had a sneer on their faces. At first, Brando thought that he had encountered a melodramatic scene, but he soon realized that it was not the case. But before he could say anything, the Count's daughter behind him was already scared out of her wits. Miss Enide looked at the scene with a pale face and couldn't help but ask in fear, "What the hell is going on?" Seeing this scene, Chiara pursed her lips, but was unwilling to speak. Among all of them, Duke Viro's daughter was more knowledgeable. She explained to the others in a low voice, "These people are refugees." "So that's how it is." Brando finally understood. Ever since Erwin's royal faction lost power in the Frost upheaval, the kingdom had been in turmoil. This turmoil in the entire kingdom was manifested in the chaos of war. The struggle between the royal family and the local nobles was only a small part of it. When the central government gradually lost its binding power, the conflicts between the local lords became the first to become acute. Whether it was for the sake of competing for territory, population, or support, large and small wars always continued. This situation was not so intense in the south. On one hand, it was because of Madara. On the other hand, after the Battle of Ampere Seal, the north was temporarily assigned to the eldest son of the king. North of Cipher, the nobles seemed to have lost their order for a while. In these areas that were under the influence of the royal family of Covardo, the royal family of Cipher, the Wind Elves, and the Holy Cathedral of Fire, war seemed to have become a daily necessity. And with the war came a large number of refugees. A small number of these refugees were accepted by Tonajol, but more of them flowed to the north, to the Empire. For the Empire, this was not a big deal. The refugees needed to find a place to provide them with a livelihood, and the Empire was happy to accept this labor force. But the problem was, with the increasing number of refugees, not only did it bring benefits to the Empire, but it also brought troubles and burdens. The direction where the refugees migrated to originally had residents, and the nobles of the empire could not accept all the laborers. The remaining idle people gradually became a hidden danger to the local public security. Coupled with the fact that the arrival of these refugees harmed the interests of the local residents, over time, these refugees became synonymous with unwelcome in the empire. Since then, the people of Cruz began to refuse to accept these refugees into the country. What was happening in front of them was obviously such a scene. "Sister, what will happen to them?" Among all of them, the youngest Loli of the Grenoires family looked at the scene with some fear and asked. "They will be treated as thieves and vagabonds, tied to a pillar here and shown to the public, and then driven back." The descendants of the Erewhon nobles showed some embarrassment on their faces. What a disgrace, the face of the kingdom has been lost by these lowly people. Avram could not help but mutter angrily, "No wonder the nobles of the empire always act superior in front of us." Chapter 907. Avram wanted to say something more, but when he saw Brendel staring at him coldly, he quickly shrunk his neck and swallowed the rest of his words back into his flabby stomach. The convoy continued to move forward, passing by the Empire's soldiers and refugees. Everyone's gaze swept past the trembling men, women, and children, but most of them did not say a word. Enid and the Duke's daughter from Viro felt that the atmosphere in the convoy was a little strange. The little girl from the Grenoires family held tightly onto her wet nurse's hand, looking a little timid. Eek, who was following closely behind Brendel, looked like he wanted to help the refugees. He kept looking at Brendel's direction, but did not get permission to do so. The sergeant from Yanalasu followed behind him, one hand on the hilt of the sword hanging at his waist. His eyes were fixed on the imperial soldiers. Kiera, on the other hand, looked on coldly from the sidelines. This little girl with an extremely uncoordinated large scholar's hat stood beside Enid and watched all of this with a cold gaze that was far beyond her age. Occasionally, her expression would reveal a mocking expression towards Avram and the others. The Shire, Hippamra, and Metasha had their own thoughts, but they stood behind Brando, waiting for orders. Yuta looked at the refugees and frowned slightly. She had seen too many of such scenes in this kingdom. Brando didn't even look at the refugees. His eyes didn't even linger on the Imperial soldiers. He pursed his lips and led the convoy through the chaos with a cold face. The Imperial knight who passed by him was ignored as if he didn't exist. Although the people in the diplomatic party had been together for almost 2 weeks, they still weren't familiar with the temperament of their commander. They only knew that he was a close vassal of Her Highness and that he was as powerful as Duke Aurek in the past. Whether it was Avram or Duke Viro's daughter, most of them were warned not to offend this count who was bound to be powerful in the future. Therefore, if Brando didn't say anything, they didn't dare to act on their own. The convoy remained silent as they approached the towering gate of Ebon Rampart step by step. The diplomatic party quickly passed by the caravans. The refugees who were detained had long been left behind. For a moment, only Eek was still looking at the back of the convoy reluctantly. He frowned and didn't try to hide the anxiety on his face, as if he didn't understand why the Count, who he had always respected and was full of knight spirit, didn't let him do anything. However, Brando's image in his heart had already reached an unattainable height. Since Brando didn't say anything, although he was anxious, he could only stay in the convoy. He turned around and found that the little Loli from the Grenoir's family was also looking at him. She tilted her head and looked at him, her light brown eyes full of confusion. She didn't seem to understand why those people were arrested. She was only 7 or 8 years old. The world of nobles was still too far away from her. The scouts in front of the diplomatic party had already reported to the people of Cruz, so at this time, the people of Cruz also knew the origin of this noble convoy. The convoy slowly arrived at the Black Sword Fortress. Brando raised his hand to stop everyone. Not long after the convoy stopped, 3 knights of Cruz riding on land dragons came in front of them. The leading knight was wearing a silver-gray ceremonial breastplate full of shining metals. Brando saw the color of his ribbon and the long mane on his helmet and knew that this man was a knight captain. Behind him, the Grand Duke of Viro's daughter had a slight change of expression. According to the normal etiquette of the Holy Cathedral of Fire to communicate with the subordinate countries, the Empire should at least send the deputy of the highest official here to verify the identity of the official envoys and welcome them into the city. Now, Cruz sent a mere knight captain to replace them, which was blatant arrogance. This was not the first time such a thing happened. As early as 3 years ago, when Cruz's envoys went to the Empire to meet the Emperor to celebrate the new year, they were treated like this. Perhaps even earlier than that. Long before the Year of Frost, the kingdom's envoys seemed to have been used to this kind of disrespect. But in the past, when the Grand Duke's daughter read about this from the history books, she only felt that Erewhon's national strength was weak and that it was natural for a behemoth like the Empire to be superior in front of him. But now, when it was her turn to experience Cruz's disrespect, she could not help but feel a sense of resentment in her heart. But she was sensible enough not to say anything. The others in the convoy more or less felt that the atmosphere was a little strange, but except for Chiara and the Shire, the others had limited understanding of diplomatic procedures, so they could only wait silently for Brando to make a decision. Brando had already expected this. He gently patted the still ignorant Avram's shoulder and asked the meatball to submit the document. It was only then that the latter reacted. He quickly took out the document and the seal ring, and respectfully presented them to the Knight of Cruz with both hands. He was so humble that even the sergeant behind E could not stand it and showed a look of dissatisfaction. But the Knight of Cruz did not appreciate it. He impatiently took the document, glanced at it, and then threw it back to Avram. These few movements made even the most ignorant Avram realize that the document in his hand was Erewhon's letter of credence. If the other party was a marquis of the Empire's border, he would not dare to say a word even if the letter of credence was thrown back in his face. But the other party was just a small knight captain. Strictly speaking, he was not a real noble. He could not help but stare at the other party with his mouth agape. He did not understand where the other party's confidence came from. But the Knight of Cruz ignored him. He looked at the meatball with disgust and waved his hand. Come with me. Avram stood there and did not dare to move. He subconsciously turned to look at Brando. This was no longer the etiquette that the Empire should use to welcome other countries under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Or rather, there was no etiquette at all. No matter how stupid he was, he knew that if he acted on his own initiative, the crime of a diplomatic breach would fall on his head. But the meatball found that Brando did not seem to see him and stood there motionless. Helpless, he could only tremble with fear and said to the Knight of Cruz, "Sir Knight, this doesn't seem to be in accordance with the rules." He hoped that it was a moment of carelessness on the part of the people of Cruz and forgot about diplomatic etiquette. But to his disappointment, the knight looked at him coldly. "It's a time of war now. We can't open the Knight's Gate to welcome you. If you are not satisfied with anything, you can choose to take a detour or go back the way you came." Note: the Knight's Gate was the name given by Duke Semple to the front gate of the fortress in honor of the soldiers of Cruz who died in this fortress. Go back the way you came. Avram was sweating profusely. At this moment, he had really seen the arrogance of the Krolotzians. He used to think that this was natural. This world respected strength, and the Krolotzians' fists were big and hard enough, so showing such an attitude was tolerable. But when he enjoyed this arrogance, he realized how hateful it was. If he could, he wanted to punch the guy in front of him in the face and then throw a punch at the damn Count Tonagel's face. Of course, this was just a thought. Even if he had 10 times the courage, he wouldn't have the guts to do it. But when he was in a dilemma, Brando finally opened his mouth. "Avram, tell him that we can't go back." Avram's voice was holy. He hurriedly looked back at the people of Cruz. The knight seemed to have expected this. He couldn't help but smile contemptuously. "Then please follow me, Sir Envoys." He deliberately emphasized the word, Sir Envoys. Coupled with his heavy Cruz accent, his words were full of sarcasm. This sentence made Avram's heart tremble. He was afraid that the arrogant commander would not be able to hold back his sarcasm. Other than him, the other people in the envoy group also frowned, especially Count Janalesu's right-hand man behind Eek. As a soldier, his right hand was already tightly gripping the hilt of his sword. Although Avram was famous for being a hedonistic aristocrat in Karsuk, he still had the ability to observe people's expressions. Naturally, he could sense the tense atmosphere. He wiped his sweat and kept glancing at Brando. He wanted the Count to make a statement, whether he was dead or alive. But unfortunately, Brando still stood there motionlessly as if he didn't hear the words of the Knight of Cruz. This time, the Knight of Cruz finally realized that something was wrong. He directly ignored the fatty in front of him and raised his head to look at Brando strangely. He realized that this was the leader of these Aruan people. Although he didn't know who the other party was, it didn't stop him from speaking. He replied with some arrogance, "What's the matter, everyone? Are you going to stay here forever?" Brando glanced at the guy. He had already gotten used to the arrogant faces of these Cruz people in his previous life. Central nobles like Veronica, Lenoret, and Brund were slightly better, but these Cruz soldiers at the border had more chances to interact with the Aruan people. It was as if the trembling refugees and the Aruan nobles had already spoiled their temper. Therefore, this group of people was almost the most arrogant group of people in the empire. In their eyes, the Aruan people were only a little higher than beasts. This attitude became especially obvious after the First War of the Black Rose. Later, during the period of Aruan's resurgence, it even affected the Cruz players. Dealing with the Cruz Empire of that era was simply a matter of infuriating for the Aruan players. Compared to the past, this attitude was still considered good. At least, he did not openly mock and ridicule Roland. But Brendel did not feel the slightest bit of gratitude just because of this better attitude, because he was here to look for trouble. To other people, going to the Empire as an ambassador was to participate in the mobilization ceremony before the Holy War, but to him, this purpose was actually dispensable. He stared at the cruise knight and could not help but curse in his heart. However, he still suppressed his emotions and replied faintly, "We came here to go to the Empire, so naturally, we will not stay here, nor will we go back the way we came." "Mr. Knight, do you understand?" "Very well, then what do you mean?" The cruise knight seemed to have heard the funniest thing in the world. He looked at Brando's group as if he was looking at a group of idiots. He thought that this group of country bumpkins must have come from some remote place and had never seen the world before. Otherwise, how could they be so dumb? "What we mean is that you must follow the etiquette and open the main gate to welcome the delegation into the fortress. This is related to the dignity of the Empire, and also to prove to the world that you cruise people are at least not ignorant of etiquette." Brando replied concisely. The Duke's daughter opened her mouth in the back. This time, not to mention the Kurlutz Knight, even she felt that her commander had suddenly become so rigid. The Kurlutz people made it clear that they wanted to belittle them and give these country bumpkins a show of strength. These diplomatic etiquette did not need the Count to remind them. Obviously, the Kurlutz people were already well aware of it, but they did it on purpose. However, if Brando did not expose this last bit of embarrassment, then both sides could still save some face. However, after Brando exposed this last bit of embarrassment, if the cruise people still insisted on doing this, then the delegation would lose all face. Of course, she did not believe that the Count of Tonagel was that simple. She faintly felt that Brando seemed to be deliberately forcing the Count into a dead end. At the same time, the cruise knight's face also changed. "What are you talking about?" He could not help but shout in anger, "I said that it is a time of war, and it is impossible to open the Knight's Gate. Don't you understand, sir? This is the border between the Erewhon Kingdom and the Cruise Empire. I have never heard of any war." Brendel ignored the knight's reprimand, and replied nonchalantly, "You're right. You're right. Is that so?" The knight could not help but sneer, "Then you can go and convince the Marquis that this order is given by him. If you can convince him that there is no threat of war here, then I will personally open the Knight's Gate to welcome you into the city." Brando looked at him and replied, "Well, I will convince your Marquis, but according to etiquette, you are not qualified to welcome us. This honor was originally reserved for your Marquis deputy, but if I go and convince him, then I am afraid that he will have to personally come and welcome us as an apology." The cruise knight could not help but stare at him as if he was looking at a madman. "In your dreams," he finally said, "Well, if you don't want to go in with me, then you can wait here. Of course, you are welcome to persuade our Marquis at any time." After that, he left Brando's group and returned to the fortress with his men. It seemed that he really did not want to bother with these Erewhon country bumpkins. After the Kurlutzians left, Avram, the Duke's daughter, and the others subconsciously looked at their leader. Avram only thought that the Count wanted to show off his courage so that he could advance in order to retreat, but the young lord obviously did not expect the Kurlutzians to never fall for this. The Duke's daughter was silent, but she obviously had the same thought in her mind. But the problem was that now that the Kurlutz people had left, they couldn't stay here forever, but whether it was going back or going to the Marquis, it would be a humiliating thing. This matter was obviously caused by their leader, so if someone had to come out and clean up the aftermath, it would naturally be the leader who should come out first. But Brando did not seem to care about this matter at all. He looked up at the towering wall, then turned back and said to the Shire behind him, "The cruise's men are stubborn. 60 years ago, 60 years later, and even today, this has never changed. The Shire, go to my carriage and bring me my sword." Avram did not understand the meaning of this sentence, but the Duke's daughter, who was more astute than him, had already reacted. She stared at the leader of the envoy group, dumbfounded. She seemed to have just remembered that the leader of the envoy group was a sword saint. "No," she quickly objected, "Count, you can't be so impulsive." Brando looked at her and asked, "How am I impulsive, Miss Eugenie?" He actually asked me why I was impulsive. The Duke's daughter almost pulled her hair out. She originally thought that Brando was just a little young and impetuous, but now it seemed that he was completely crazy. She could not help but shout, "If you are going to threaten and kidnap the Marquis, it may cause a war." Brando could not help but be stunned. Who said that I am going to threaten and kidnap a real noble? Miss Eugenie, you can't wantonly slander my reputation. You don't plan to do that. The Duke's daughter was stunned. Of course. You swear. Miss Duchess, although it's not that I don't like to joke, this joke of yours is a little too much. Brando replied sternly. This time, the Duke's daughter was a little suspicious. She could not help but stare at Brando suspiciously. But Brando really did not plan to kidnap that bullshit Marquis. First of all, he did not know where the Marquis was. He could not go in and out of this fortress 7 times. But at this time, the Shire had already brought his sword. This sword was not the black Halran Gaia that he was used to using, but a crystal-like sword that seemed to be carved out of ice. Brando took the sword and weighed it in his hand, then raised his head and stared at the fortress that had a history of nearly 400 years. You have to understand one thing, Miss Eugenie. Brando replied, I never do such troublesome things. After saying this, he raised the sword and waved it at the gate of the fortress. A bright silver line seemed to rise from the ground, and in an instant, it slanted and pierced through the clouds. Chapter 908. It was hard to describe with words, but at that moment, the members of the Erewhon envoys under the fortress saw it for themselves. Brando's casual swinging of the sword seemed to be subdivided into several parts, and each of them could be used as a textbook example of swordsmanship. At that moment, swordsmanship was no longer just a skill to kill, but an art that was pleasing to the eyes. Swordsmanship and the law seemed to be the line of truth that came from the Flame King and the Dragon Clan's ancient swordsmanship. The skills of the Flame King and the mysterious power of the ancient holy sword merged into one at that moment. The dazzling light of the sword rose from the ground, and behind that dazzling brilliance, there was an earth-shattering sound. The huge iron gate was split into 4, and the impact caused the whole gate to sink inwards. Then, it fell apart and flew towards the barbican behind it. The aftermath of the sword aura blended into the walls on both sides, and a smooth cut grew on the black rock at a speed visible to the naked eye. Then, the whole section of the wall began to collapse downwards. As the bricks and debris fell like rain, the law of the law that maintained the strength of the wall also appeared one by one in the air. These silver lines that represented the power of magic also melted as the sword aura advanced, as if they could not resist it at all. In short, the Knight's Gate of the Black Sword Fortress became history after this sword aura. The refugees were tied to the wooden stakes on both sides of the road in the valley by the Imperial soldiers, but suddenly, everyone's eyes were attracted to that direction. They saw the bright light of the sword rising from the valley, saw the dazzling light of the sword slashing diagonally into the towering Knight's Gate, and saw 1/5 of the fortress wall turned into ashes under the sword aura. They saw a man and a sword standing in front of the Empire, as if he did not need anyone's orders. All the Imperial soldiers who witnessed this scene dropped what they were doing. Those refugees who were supposed to be tied to the wooden stakes were also thrown aside. No one had the time to care about them, but these people did not seem to want to take the opportunity to escape. The Ash Sword Saint. The first thing the Kurlutzians thought of was a famous name. The Sword Saint Darius. Erewhon's people were the first to recall their widespread legends. Everyone was stunned. Even the well-armored knights on horseback were at a loss. It seemed like the fortress was under attack, but it was beyond their imagination. It was not their fault. The last time the stronghold was attacked was recorded in historical documents. It was so long ago that it was like a fairy tale. Some people would have thought that this legendary event would happen again in their lifetime. The small group of Imperial soldiers outside the fortress froze in place as if they had been bewitched, but the nobles around Brando weren't any better. Duke Viro's daughter, Miss Eugenie, had turned into a puppet. All her movements were frozen at the moment before Brando drew his sword. Even her eyeballs seemed to have lost their ability to move. She just stared at Brando, but it was hard to tell whether she was looking at a madman or an idiot. Avram was scared out of his wits. The ball-shaped creature's mouth was wide open. Judging from the look of shock on his face, even if someone threw a pigeon egg into his mouth, he wouldn't notice. BB count. Miss Enid seemed to be so scared that even her voice was trembling. Even Chiara couldn't help but look at Brendel as if he was a monster. Do you know what you've done? Brando withdrew his sword and did not answer their questions. At this time, the door of Dilferi's carriage in the convoy behind opened a crack, and the little Prince Haruz finally couldn't help but poke his head out and asked cautiously, Teacher, Miss Dilferi asked you what happened? Nothing. Brando replied. Nothing. Eugenie finally reacted. She seemed to have been greatly stimulated and almost jumped up without caring about noble etiquette. Do you want to declare war on the Empire? The princess's words seemed to be stuck in her throat as she suddenly remembered something. She looked at Brendel with fear in her eyes. Count Trendheim. Count Trendheim. Count Trendheim, my lord, don't tell me you really. But before she could finish her sentence, she was pulled back by Brendel, because a glaring sword light had appeared between the two of them. Brendel raised the frost chant and blocked the sudden longsword, and the sound of metal clashing against metal could be heard as the two swords clashed against each other. With the sword as the center, silver and golden lines extended at the same time. The lines of law were like a curved shield, completely blocking the attack on the other side. The golden raindrops fell on Brando's silver net formed by the lines of law, but did not penetrate it at all. Cruz finally reacted. This sudden attack was completely out of the Duke's daughter's expectations. She was shocked and naturally swallowed the second half of her sentence. Brando, on the other hand, understood the origin of his opponent in this short exchange. Golden Sacred Flame. His opponent was also an elemental rank. But unfortunately, he was still far from being able to catch up to him. The exchange of swords happened in an instant. Brando snorted slightly and swung his sword a second time in an instant, hitting the man's sword. The man immediately screamed, "Truths." He flew back towards the city wall and crashed into the rubble that was filled with smoke and dust. There was another Kurlutz knight who was about to rush over from the direction of the collapsed walls, but when he saw Brendel's sword, his expression changed and he stopped in his tracks. He asked Brendel fearfully, "Who are you, and why are you attacking the Empire?" Brendel sheathed his sword and silently returned the frost chant to its slender scabbard. This crystal scabbard was specially made by the wizards of Buga. Originally, Brando did not need it, but these craftsmen were all perfectionists. They loved this legendary sword so much that they could not bear to part with it. They could not wait to make a complete set of equipment, from the scabbard to the sword holder. However, it was a pity that even the silver citizens were unable to repair this legendary holy sword. Brando put the scabbard back in the Shire's hand, then picked up Halran Gaia and looked back at the knight. The armor on his body was obviously not cheap. The accessories on the armor were basically made of pure gold or real mithril, not gilded fake. He also wore a knight's badge, but like most people, he did not wear a knight's badge. He did not like to wear a helmet, revealing a head of light golden shoulder-length hair. He looked like a middle-aged man in his 50s or 60s. Brando could tell at a glance the identity of this person. The Frontier Legion stationed at the Black Sword Fortress in this era should be the noble army from Rogeria. The commander of this army was Marquis Sova Bridgewell, and the Legion had 3 elemental rank masters, Fire Wolf Ivan, Imperial Sword Rovak, and White Shadow Fana. The person in front of him was Imperial Sword Rovak. Rovak. Although Brando had not dealt with this person in his previous life, he knew that his elemental element was the rarer water element in Cruz. He was also good at Cruz's knight and noble swordsmanship. He also mastered this Rogeria's secret swordsmanship, which was also an intermediate-level swordsmanship. This person was good at swordsmanship, but he was very cautious and meticulous in his actions. In fact, although there were many elemental awakeners in the Empire, they were not cabbages after all. Among them, most of the players in Cruz and the countries under the Holy Cathedral of Fire were still familiar with their names. After Brando recognized this person, he could not help but look at him curiously. In his previous life, this person was a legendary figure among the Erewhon players. Of course, this legend was not about how strong he was later, but because he was one of the 6 elemental awakeners stationed at the Erewhon border of the Empire. It should be known that in this era of history, the entire Erewhon Kingdom's elemental awakeners were only a few people. There were no more than 10 people in the north and south. And these people, in the eyes of the Year of the Sword, who was just a newbie at that time, were all existences that he had to look up to. But today, one of these legendary existences was casually sent flying by him. If he guessed correctly, the guy who controlled the golden sacred flame element should be the Firewolf AI fan. Then, the Imperial Sword Rovak was also frightened by the power of his sword and did not dare to make a move. Brando looked at Rovak, who had a serious expression, and for a moment, he could not help but have such a strange thought in his mind. After sighing, he shook his head and replied seriously, "Mr. Rovak, you should know who I am. As for why I am doing this, Mr. Rovak, you should understand. But then again, now that things have developed to this point, if I want you to persuade your Lord Marquis, let him bring people to welcome the Kurlut's envoys into the fortress. Do you think you can still do it?" In contrast to Brando's understanding, Rovak was extraordinarily serious. His strength was on par with the Firewolf AI fan. Just now, when Brando counterattacked and sent AI fan flying with his sword, it revealed a certain meaning that made the alarm bells in his heart go off. That seemingly indestructible power of the law was obviously on another level. That was the level of the truth, the side of the truth. Rovak did not know that Brando actually borrowed a part of the power of the Frost Chant Sinna, and that his true strength was actually quite far away from the elemental truth. However, in this Imperial Knight's heart, he had already regarded Brando as his #1 enemy. He was stationed at the border between the Empire and Erewhon, so he was not as well informed about this ancient kingdom as the nobles of the Empire. Therefore, he did not know where the young man in front of him came from. He was inexplicably surprised. When did such a genius appear among the people of Erewhon? It was as if he appeared out of thin air. After listening to Brando's words, he was extremely regretful. Today, he and AI fan were on duty on the city wall, so naturally, he was aware of what happened below. However, he did not think that the people of Erewhon's disrespect was a big deal. Before this, no one had raised any objections about it, whether it was the people of Cruz or the people of Erewhon. Everything was taken for granted. However, he never dreamed that things would develop to this point. This guy actually split the Knight's Gate in half with his sword. Rovak somewhat understood Brando's thoughts. If he was a sacred swordsman of the elemental truth level, he would also be furious when a mere knight captain made things difficult for him. However, he could not help but feel like crying. Who would have thought that a sacred swordsman would suddenly appear among the people of Erewhon? Furthermore, there was not even the slightest bit of news about this in the past few years. It was as if a freak had suddenly appeared in this year. Of course, Rovak did not expect that his thoughts were almost the truth. This world was just so crazy. He only moved his Adam's apple and replied with some difficulty, "I'm afraid that's not possible." "That's why," Brando replied, "our conversation is meaningless, Mr. Rovak. Since you can't do it, let me do it myself." After saying that, he raised Halran Gaia and took a step forward. Your Excellency, you can't do that. The Duke's daughter seemed to have just reacted. She was a little numb as she watched Brando severely injure an Imperial swordsman in front of her. He also scared the other Imperial swordsmen to the point of stopping. Of course, she knew these two people, but she was more willing to admit her mistake because everything in front of her was just too crazy. Even her voice was a little weak as she said, "We can't anger the people of Cruz anymore. Your Excellency, are you going to declare war on the Empire?" Rovac was about to cry. He could not help but wonder if this person in front of him was a lunatic. Even if he was a sacred swordsman, how could he do such a crazy thing? For a moment, he vaguely felt that he saw the shadow of another person in Brando. In the hearts of the people of Cruz, that person was also a complete madman. A complete madman. That person's name was Mephisto. Declaration of war. Brando was a little amused. He glanced at Rovac, then at Eugenie, and replied, "Miss Eugenie, we are also believers of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. We are responding to the call of the Holy Cathedral to participate in a holy war. But here, we are being unreasonably humiliated by a group of ignorant people. Therefore, it is hard for me not to suspect that these people are trying to deny the legitimacy and God of this war. Saint, now I intend to correct their point of view. Not only is it not to declare war on the Empire, but it is to eliminate some stubborn people for the Holy Cathedral. Therefore, contrary to what you think, I am doing this to show the firm and loyal position of the people of Erewhon. Not only will they not be condemned, I think they should be rewarded for this." Eugenie looked at him, dumbfounded. This was clearly the logic of a bandit. But she opened her mouth and suddenly understood what Brando meant. If they inexplicably attacked one of the Empire's fortresses, it would naturally be taken as a declaration of war. But according to what he said, it would be a different situation. The key point was, at this juncture of the Holy War, would the Holy Cathedral of Fire push Erewhon out? Would the Silver Queen suddenly let her south become the most unstable factor in the war? The answer was obvious. She suddenly remembered what Brando had said to them before. A big country had its strength, a small country had its wisdom, and Erewhon also had its own advantages. Indeed, compared to the gains and losses of the entire Holy War, why would the Holy Cathedral of Fire and His Majesty the Emperor be entangled in these details of dignity and face? Chiara obviously understood this at this moment. Understanding Brando's meaning, the little girl snorted softly, "You're thinking too much. Be careful not to get burned by playing with fire." Brando shook his head gently. He was indeed playing with fire, but it was just that he had to play with it. He looked up and waited for Rovac's reply. Rovac's face had already become extremely ugly. He was not stupid and naturally understood the meaning of Brando's words. But he took a light breath and the pride of being an imperial citizen finally prevailed. "You are very strong, Count Rovac, but do you intend to challenge an imperial army alone?" "I can tell you categorically, Monsieur le Count, that is impossible, and no matter what His Majesty the Emperor's final answer, I am here to tell you, with the glory of the Cruz army, that we will never let you take half a step into this fortress." "If you insist on going to war with us," Rovac shouted, "Cruz Knight, prepare for battle." Brando only heard a soft whoosh and subconsciously looked up. He saw that the griffin cages on the city walls had been opened one after another. Dozens of griffins flew out of the city walls in an instant. These birds of prey in the air screeched and spread their wings. For a moment there was an illusion that they covered the sky. The Imperial Army. Someone in the valley shouted in a shrill voice. The scene in front of him was exactly the same as what he had seen in the Holy War 10 years later. The prosperity of the Empire was built on the pride of its citizens. This glorious army was enough to shock anyone who saw it for the first time. But unfortunately, Brando looked at the white birds of prey that flew out of the city walls. He placed one hand on the scabbard of Halran Gaia and the other hand gently pulled out the dark blade of the sacred sword. He had already seen this scene before. He casually threw the scabbard behind him and raised Halran Gaia in front of him. "There is something I have to tell you, my army has never been alone." As if to prove this sentence, countless black dots rose from the mountains. PS == strange, I remember I sent it at 11 o'clock. Thank you for reminding me, I was almost late. Chapter 909. What rose from the mountains were magical creatures that were sculpted from rocks into flying monsters full of power. They had the head of a goat and the body of a human. They had steel-like claws on their limbs and a wingspan of more than 7 meters. Their stony skin shone with a pale green luster under the cold winter sun. They were covered with faintly glowing magic runes, and 2 ghostly green gems formed the eyes of these magical creatures. They were not the most primitive gargoyles, but a type of rune golem, rune gargoyles. Brando wanted gargoyles, and Tanya, the competent ant, got him the best one. As he said, these things were nothing to the Bugas, so the craftsman mages were happy to help Brando as much as possible without crossing their bottom line, so that he could take back the azure lance for them. The griffins that soared in the sky of the Empire never thought that they would one day face such a battle. The densely packed gargoyles were rising from the mountains into the sky, and in the blink of an eye, they occupied the sky above the mountains. The screams of these magical creatures came one after another, coming from all directions as if they were surrounded. However, the griffins let out a clear and melodious cry at the same time, as if a kind of pride was urging the brave and fearless birds to spread their snow-white wings and meet their enemy. That was the symbol of the Imperium. They took the initiative to attack the enemy that was dozens of times larger than them. They were like straight silver lines that pierced into the dark clouds, but in the next moment, their wings were scattered and their spears were broken. The Imperial soldiers looked at the scene in a daze, watching the ferocious birds of prey of the Empire that they were so proud of vanish in an instant. After a while, a dry warning came from the observation room. It looks like gargoyles." Although there were still 100 Griffin Knight on standby in the fortress, everyone's feet were rooted to the ground at this moment. No one ran down the wall to inform the others, because it was too late. The gargoyles were like a dark cloud in the sky. After swallowing the griffins, they spread across half the sky like a flock of migrating birds. When they came over the fortress, the Imperial soldiers still looked up in a daze. It was not until the first rock fell from the sky and smashed the battlements into pieces that they screamed and reacted. A disaster was imminent. Under the preset command, the gargoyles split into 3 as soon as they entered the sky above the fortress, and 3 huge arrowheads in the air pointed in different directions. The first arrowhead made up of 200 gargoyles pointed directly in the direction of the wall, while the second arrowhead made up of 300 gargoyles pointed to the inner city. The remaining gargoyles made up of the largest arrowhead went straight to the headquarters of the Griffin Knight in the Black Sword Fortress, as if they already knew where it was. When the Kurlutzian knights on the city wall saw the 2 huge arrows in the sky flying over the city wall without stopping, they understood what was going on. Their faces were ashen, and only then did they realize that this was definitely a premeditated war. The inner city was in a state of chaos. The soldiers who were not on duty in the fortress area were being rushed out of their residences in the inner city, from various places of entertainment such as bars, brothels, and even lovers' houses. Some were even rushing out from the streets in 2s and 3s. They hurriedly put on their battle robes, put on their helmets, and picked up their weapons. They were either organized or scattered as they rushed towards the direction of the fortress to report. If it was during the Age of Glory, the Age of Chaos, or the half a century before and after the War of Walnut, such a scene would never occur. During that era, even when the Black Sword Fortress was at its most lax, more than 2/3 of the soldiers were on standby at all times. But now, this fortress had not experienced any war for nearly 100 years. Even the bandits of Erewhon did not dare to commit crimes in the area ruled by the Empire. After a long period of slacking, they had long developed the habit of being arrogant and condescending. The Empire's soldiers were gathering from all directions. Although they were not worth mentioning compared to their predecessors, the last trace of honor and discipline of the Empire's soldiers prevented them from completely messing up. Overall, their reaction was much better than the noble soldiers of the south of Erewhon. They were even not inferior to the Black Blade Squad and the Coast Guards that Brando had seen in Ampere Seal. These Rogelia soldiers wearing red and white battle robes gathered under the urging of the bugle and were about to enter the fortress area. It was at this time that they collided head-on with the gargoyles that were rushing from the sky. "Look at the sky!" Someone shouted first, and then the bustling red and white crowd on the street slowly stopped and looked up at the sky. The dense black dots that formed a huge arrowhead were dispersing and then swooping down. In an instant, hundreds of gargoyles swooped down. Gargoyles! "Martha above, the Bugas have launched a sneak attack on us." The crowd was surprised and stunned at first, then it turned into a commotion and uneasiness. They began to retreat, and finally, under such a shrill scream, it turned into a mad dash. "Look for cover. These damned, cunning adepts." The people of Cruz screamed in panic as they tried to find a place to provide shelter. At this moment, the quality of the Empire's soldiers was fully displayed. They did not panic like headless flies, nor did they flee in panic like the noble soldiers of the south of Erewhon. Once the Cruz knights found eaves, low walls, stacked boxes, or other temporary shelter along the street that could provide shelter, they immediately pulled out their weapons and waited for the first wave of attack from the unknown air force before launching a counterattack. The Empire had a military tradition of more than 10 centuries. Their enemies came from all over the world, whether it was the Air Force, the Navy, the monsters, the living, or the returnees. For this army that had been through hundreds of battles and had a profound tradition, it was no surprise. Therefore, after a brief commotion, they immediately calmed down and entered a state of readiness under the command of the nearby knight captain. At this moment, if Brando were to see this scene in person, he would be amazed. He would be amazed at the strength of the people of Cruz, and also because this was the same as the Empire's army that he had seen before. After all, the Empire was the Empire. The eagles of Cruz did not just soar in the sky with pride and arrogance. However, the tragedy of the Rogelia soldiers came from the same reason. Brando had seen them before, in another era. Therefore, these soldiers soon saw that the gargoyles' dive was just an illusion. They immediately began to slow down when they approached the sky above the inner city, and then they landed on the rows of roofs throughout the inner city. "What are they doing?" The Knight of Cruz looked at this scene with inexplicable amazement. The Air Force, as the name implied, was their domain in the sky. If these gargoyles wanted to fight them on the ground, it was obviously impossible. Their doubts were finally answered when they saw the first wizard in a robe and holding a staff jump down from the back of a gargoyle. Wizard, in the nearby streets, every knight sergeant with command felt a little sour in his teeth when he saw this scene. He immediately understood what the other party wanted to do. When Mordenkainen jumped down from the back of his gargoyle with his duck familiar in his arms, he was full of pride when he saw the stunned Cruz knight. He looked back and saw that almost every roof on the left had 3 to 4 wizards ready. It was as if an army of wizards had arrived in the inner city of the Black Sword Fortress in an instant. He looked back again, and at this time, the people of Cruz below seemed to have just recovered from their state of shock. The knight immediately commanded the soldiers around him to attack the roofs. Although he knew that the other party could not pose any threat to him, he could not help but feel a little nervous. What a bold idea it was to let wizards come to the front line and fight the enemy soldiers face to face. Not to mention that he had never heard of such a battle before, he had never even thought about it. The so-called wizards naturally wanted to stay as far away from danger as possible. But although he was nervous and his palms were sweaty, he still raised his staff and began to chant spells at the army of crews below. The average strength of the soldiers of the Imperial Frontier Legion was at least above the middle level of black iron. The low roofs of the inner city were not too difficult for them. In a short while, some Imperial soldiers climbed up the roofs with the help of the terrain. Mordenkainen saw that the nearest soldier was less than 20 feet away from him. He could even see the ferocious face of the other party and the cold gleam of the long sword in his hand. In his heart, he was more than willing to directly throw the spells he had prepared at that guy. But at the last moment, he forcibly shifted his target and raised his staff to cast a spell at the Imperial soldiers clustered in the street. The law of stillness and stagnation, imprison. Mordenkainen shouted. As if there was an invisible wall descending from the direction he was pointing at, there was a slight vibration in the air. All the Imperial soldiers on the street immediately became motionless as if they were possessed. At the same time, out of the hundreds of magi that descended with the gargoyles, about a third of them completed the same control spell. The other third were too nervous and failed to cast the spell, while the remaining third could not help but cast the spell on the few soldiers closest to them. But even this one-third success rate caused almost half of the streets in the inner city to be completely controlled by the spell in an instant. After casting the spell, Mordenkainen turned his head back, sweating profusely. Only then did he see that the soldier who had climbed up had already been slapped down by the gargoyle. Only then did he breathe a sigh of relief, and a faint sense of pride grew in his heart, because he knew that at least he was the first wizard to cast a spell under this kind of tactic. Based on this point alone, he could already shake off the identity of an apprentice and step into the ranks of an official wizard. The inner city was falling into a special kind of dead silence, as if time had been frozen. The Imperial soldiers who had gathered and jammed the streets quickly lost the ability to fight back under the control of the wizards. It was not that they did not think of counterattacking, but the result of such a dense formation exposed to the attack of magic was imaginable. Almost immediately, they lost more than two-thirds of their manpower. Next, the sorcerers only needed to subdue the fish that escaped the net one by one. In the meantime, the Kurlutz Zero-Star organization launched a long-range attack together, but it was almost useless under the protection of spells. The commando team formed by the Imperial Knights, under the protection of hundreds of gargoyles, also had no effect. Instead, they fell into the trap and became captives. Of course, the Empire also had wizards, but wizards in 2s and 3s were basically no match for hundreds of wizards gathered together. After sporadic counterattacks, they quickly realized that the situation was hopeless. They either raised their hands and surrendered, or simply found a place to hide and seek self-protection. It seemed that in just a moment, the Black Sword Fortress had lost most of its backup. The head of the Griffin Knight Regiment, Mariel, stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window in his office, silently watching the gargoyles in the sky leave. On the other side of his line of sight, the headquarters of the Griffin Knight Regiment had long been in a mess. This Griffin Fortress, which was built about 2 centuries ago, was tragically not built according to the standards of this era, nor was it built with magic protection. The flight path of the Griffin cage was directly exposed to the outside according to the Air Force tradition of about 200 years ago. This was because everyone knew that the enemy of the Black Sword Fortress was the Aruan people, and the weak air force of the Aruan Knight could not pose any threat to this fortress. However, it was this traditional understanding that brought about a devastating blow to the fortress. Mariel still had not figured out how those damn gargoyles came about. Originally, he was still sending a messenger to inquire about the loud noise on the other side of the wall, and at the same time, he ordered some of the night to prepare to take off. However, he did not expect the attack to come so quickly. Before the first batch of Griffin Knight could release their beloved griffins from the cages, the black cloud in the sky had already flown over the Knight Regiment. What happened next was simply a nightmare. Before that, Mariel had never heard of such an attack. The gargoyles began to dive and then threw down flashing crystals. Most of these crystals hit the passage of the Griffin cage, and a small part hit the warehouse of the Knight Regiment. What happened next was what he saw now. The passage of the griffin cage had been completely destroyed, and about 160 griffins and more than 30 knights were trapped inside. It was hard to say how many of them could be saved. As for the warehouse, Mariel looked at the two big holes in the ground with a gloomy face. For a moment, he was speechless. At this time, outside the ruins of the Knight's Gate, Rovak, who was pointing his sword at Brando, obviously did not know that such a wonderful thing had happened in the fortress behind him. Even so, his face did not look good. Above him, the Empire's soldiers were fiercely fighting with the gargoyles. The wizards in the fortress had already joined the battle, and the longbowmen and crossbowmen had also begun to get into formation. It could be said that the situation was barely stabilized. Behind him, more than 100 Drake Knights had finished their preparations. These Cruz Knights were wearing heavy armor, and they all raised their spears. The triangular flags on the spears fluttered in the wind, like a fiery red ocean. The Drake Knights were restlessly adjusting their footsteps, facing the uninvited guests outside the gate. It was as if as long as the order was given, all the knights would come out in full force. But at this moment, Rovak did not feel safe at all. This was because in his vision, Brando was approaching him step by step. This count was alone, and he was holding a sword in one hand. However, he did not seem to be at a disadvantage at all. He was only one person, and he was facing the Cruz Knights with a calm face. It was as if these glorious knights in history did not exist in his eyes. Rovak had seen such a calm look before. When the bear warriors from the Black Crow Principality charged at that man stood proudly on the battlefield with a sword in his hand. Rovak could still see that man standing proudly on the battlefield. Could it be that in less than 60 years, Erwin had another sword saint like that? Rovak's forehead was covered in cold sweat, and he suddenly thought of another possibility. Behind Brando, Medisha was looking at her lord's back. She silently summoned her unicorn and mounted it. The White City Vanguard, the Nightsong Tiger, Falerne, and the others were behind her in a charging formation, ready to attack. But at this moment, Brando turned around and said, "Medisha, go and subdue the Empire's squad and save the refugees." "My lord." Brando did not answer her. Instead, he turned to the Shire and said, "The Shire, I'll leave the wall to you." "No problem." Brando then turned around and saw Rovak charging at him. "Dragon Knights, follow me!" Rovak shouted. But in the next moment, he could no longer make such a bold sound because he saw Brando split into two in front of him. He was dumbfounded as he watched the two Brandos casually walk past him. The two Brandos raised their swords at the same time. There were no fancy moves. They just raised their swords and walked forward slowly. Even a beginner swordsman would be able to dodge it easily. Rovak also lowered his head to avoid the attack, and at the same time tried to distinguish the real Brendel from the two of them. But just as he lowered his head, a scene that made his soul fly out of his body happened. He clearly saw that he had dodged the opponent's sword, but when he lowered his head, he saw that the shining blade was still in front of his chest. This is impossible. Just as this thought appeared in Rovak's mind, he felt a slight pain in his chest. There was a long gash in his armor, and he felt his vision go dark. His knees went soft, and he knelt on the ground. Chapter 9-10. Brando slowly sheathed his sword. It didn't feel like he was fighting on the battlefield, but more like a swordsman who had returned home and carefully sealed his beloved sword. He walked past Rovak slowly, and with every step he took, there was a shadow overlapping with him. Every shadow seemed to be using a different sword technique. Erwin's military sword technique had the cruelty and ruthlessness of Madara's sword technique. Sometimes it was like Fanzin's sword technique, the sword of the White Knight of Grecius's knight, and sometimes it was the sword technique of the Cruz's people, the simple and pure sword technique of the knight. But Rovak couldn't see any of them clearly. What hit him was the simplest sword strike, the one that he thought he had dodged. However, the sword landed heavily on his breastplate, causing blood to gush out. His water element did not even have the time to play any role before it was shattered. At the last moment, he saw countless silver lines of the law of nature as his opponent slowly retracted his sword, bringing along countless fragments of his armor. Like countless sparkling spots of light, they returned to dust bit by bit. Rovak opened his mouth, as if he wanted to shout this sentence from his chest, the highest level of element, the sword of space. But in the end, he didn't make any sound. He knelt on the ground and then fell heavily. Brando gently wiped the blood on his sword, and it turned into countless rose-red beads that flew into the air like a crescent moon. The dust above the rubble was dissipating. He seemed to be walking on clouds, and the hem of his count's coat fluttered in the cold wind between the mountains. He looked up, and the distance between him and the Imperial Drake Knight Regiment was just the distance of the city gate. The Imperial Knights were regrouping, and the horn was blown. They seemed to be shouting a strange command. The Drake Knight in the front row began to move forward slowly. The ground trembled slightly, and their spears were like trees in a forest. The flags floated like the fiery Red Sea, and their shining silver armor moved up and down. Brando heard their command, and then the spears were lined up in rows, forming a bunch of intersecting lines that pointed at him. The knights began to gallop. The undulating spears were like a black wave. But at that moment, Brando thought of Scarlet. He silently looked at the knight, and a voice in his heart answered, "Did you hear that, Scarlet? No matter what Her Majesty told you, this will be the answer of the Lord of Abies." Brendel gradually quickened his pace, and the knights also began to charge forward. Both sides crossed each other in an instant, but it was as if there was an invisible force that automatically separated the Imperial Knights. Brendel passed through them, and with every step he took, he left behind an afterimage. Each afterimage raised a sword to block a knight's spear, and then threw the knight and the earth dragon into the air. He took 10 steps forward, and the knight's attack. The knight fell to the ground, and it was a mess. So this is the Sword Saint. The Duke's daughter looked at all of this with her mouth agape. She only felt that the usual worldview in her mind had been completely overturned at this moment. Her mind was full of chatter and buzzing, but she could not say a word when it reached her mouth. The development of the situation seemed to be completely out of her expectations from the beginning. She did not know what Brando wanted to do. It did not seem like he was just acting out of anger, or that he was young and impetuous. Everything he did was obviously premeditated, but she could not guess why he did it. Was it because of a subordinate who was kidnapped by the Empire? No, she did not consider this possibility at all, unless he was really crazy. But unfortunately, she thought that the most inconceivable idea might be the closest to the truth. Beside him, the ball-shaped man was already scared out of his wits, and he directly collapsed to the ground. The little princess of the Grand Duke of Grenoires held her wet nurse's hand tightly, and asked in fear, "Mother Elsa, is the Count starting a war?" The young wet nurse's face was pale, and she trembled, unable to say a word. In her opinion, this was clearly a war. Greysword Saint Mephistopheles once fought against 1,000 people in Oler, and with his sword, he made the Empire's people completely terrified. Even His Majesty the Emperor had to send out 2 knight regiments and 3 sword saints to encircle and annihilate him, but even so, he still left safely. But now, what Brando was doing was the same thing. The attack power of an elemental activation powerhouse on the battlefield was unparalleled. Although he still could not fight against a real army by himself, a mere 100 Earth Dragon Knights were not too big of a problem for him. After the first wave of attack was thwarted, the Imperial Knights immediately began to adjust their tactics, trying to surround him and suppress him as much as possible with the advantage of numbers. Generally speaking, this was the most effective way to fight against an elemental-level powerhouse. But that was only generally speaking. Brando took the last step forward. This step seemed to have crossed a distance of 100 meters in the ordinary sense. It was as if his back foot had just left the ground, and his front foot had already reached the farthest corner of the Knight Regiment's encirclement. The Earth Dragon Knight did not even have time to react. He saw the space in front of him flash slightly, and a dazzling silver splendor had spilled out from it. Then, he flew out from the Earth Dragon's back together with his saddle. Brando's sword struck out, and before the afterimage disappeared, he had already appeared in another direction. Then, there was another silver splendor, and a knight flew out diagonally. It seemed that in an instant, a dozen Brandos appeared in the gradually shrinking encirclement of the knight. The afterimages appeared one after another, and then disappeared one after another. In the end, there was only one left. Brando stood alone in the middle of the encirclement of the Imperial Knights. With him as the center, there was not a single knight on any of the Earth Dragons. Further away, the Imperial Knights on the periphery were already stunned. It was not that they had never seen a sword saint before. There were many sword saints in the Empire. There were 2 sword saints in the 4 legions, and 7 in the Holy Cathedral. This did not include the sword saints who were scattered in rumors. A century ago, the Empire had 2 sword saints who had now become legends. However, among the sword saints they knew, none of them had such strange swordsmanship. Brando flicked the dust on his black woolen sleeves, and looked up at the knight who surrounded him. He thought that his performance was not bad, but it was far from enough. He had to become famous in one battle, so that no one would dare to ignore his existence. He had to let the people of Cruz understand that he was the grandson of Darius, the successor of the Marshal of the Allied forces, and Erewhon's people were indispensable forces in the Holy War. He believed that the Silver Queen would take this into consideration. He raised his left hand, and the blessing of Bahamut shone silver under the sunlight. However, countless silver threads of the law had already risen from Brando's side. They intertwined like a silver net and instantly spread across the entire barbican. Wherever it passed, it was as if an invisible shockwave swept across the entire Knight Regiment. Brando gently clenched his hand, and the entire regiment of ground dragon knights, including hundreds of silver knights, immediately rose from the ground. As if they were affected by an anti-gravity spell, they screamed in horror and struggled, but it was useless. Brando gently pushed them, and all the knights and ground dragons were separated. It was as if a magical hand had disrupted the order and then rearranged it. The entire square was instantly empty, and the knights and ground dragons were fixed in the air in all directions. There was only one person left in front of Brando. It was a woman with a face full of wrinkles, wearing the Empire's red battle robe, holding a long sword, and a layer of fiery red threads of the law floating around her. She quietly looked at him. "Madame Savannah." Brando politely greeted her as if he had expected her to be here. "I know you." The swordswoman replied with a voice full of vicissitudes, "You are the grandson of Sword Saint Darius. If you want to protect your grandfather, why do you have to do this? If you insist on doing things your own way, you will drag many innocent people into the flames of war. Do you understand? The Empire will not tolerate such provocation." Brando looked at the elderly woman. During the Holy War, she had once served as his grandfather's adjutant. Among the 3 sword saints of the Black Sword Fortress, she was the oldest and the most powerful. Her name was White Shadow, but she was the strongest of the Golden Flame Sword Saints. But he still shook his head. "The grudge between my grandfather and the Empire can be resolved if necessary," he replied slowly, "but today's lesson is only to teach the arrogant people of the Empire a lesson. The teachings of the Holy Cathedral of Fire have never written that anyone is superior to anyone else. There may have been such an empire in history. But I want to ask you a question, Madame Savannah. Where are the people of Myrna today? Why did Guilt the Great and the 3 sages fight?" Savannah looked at him as if she was not moved by his words at all. She only shook her head. For this reason, you want to start a war so that people can face the people of Erewhon. Count guilt, this kind of honor is meaningless to the soldiers who died in battle. I think you should understand this point. The ancient saying of the 9 phoenixes, for the sake of the superiors, one must not be angry and fight. There is no war here, Madame Savannah. Brando replied. Are you deceiving yourself? There is only one dispute here, Madame Savannah. Since you people of Cruz think that Erewhon is not qualified to be respected by you, then I will use my strength to correct your point of view. There was someone in history who treated my grandfather the same way. Guess who that person was? Brando replied. Savannah's face changed slightly. The Black Raven Duchy, you mean? Brando interrupted her. I'm glad that you remember this, Madame Savannah. I will answer your question again. I am the leader of Erewhon's diplomatic corps. I fight for my kingdom and the glory of my guards. This rule is written in the ancient books of the Holy Cathedral. It is sacred and cannot be violated. Since you people of Cruz have challenged the glory of my guards, just like how the guards of the Black Raven Duchy challenged my grandfather, then you should be prepared, right? Wait, this is the logic of a bandit. We are. Savannah's face darkened. She hurriedly tried to explain, but she was interrupted by Brando for the second time. No one said that the people of Cruz can be detached from worldly affairs, right? This seems like it. But, Savannah's eyes flashed with anger. She couldn't help but say word by word, do you think that you can defeat the Border Legion of Rogeria with your little guards? I'm telling you, it's impossible, Mr. Earl. If you let the people of Cruz and Erewhon kill each other because of your selfishness, the Empire will not tolerate your sophistry, and your kingdom will not accept such an excuse. Yes, Brendel replied, at least compared to what you did in the Alcash Mountains, I'm not so cold-blooded that I can look at life and death. That's why I only want some people to lower their heads and not take their lives. Naive, wishful thinking. Savannah raised her sword and said, the people of the Empire would rather die than lower their heads. Raise your head and look at the sky, Count. Your ability is not so great that you can force us to submit. Have you seen the scene of 2 ferocious beasts of equal strength fighting each other? Grandson of Darius, if I were you, I would order your men to stop attacking immediately before the consequences are out of control. Brando shook his head and said, that's exactly what I wanted to say to you. Throw down your sword and surrender, Miss Savannah. You are not a prisoner of the enemy. You are just apologizing to your allies. Besides, your resistance is meaningless. If I were you, I would look up and see what is happening in the sky. Savannah was slightly startled. She raised her head in confusion. But not far from her, Avram and the Duke's daughter were already looking at the sky. The Empire's wizards were like specks of dust floating above the walls of the Black Sword Fortress. In the sky above the fortress, the Black Rune Gargoyles' attacks and the Empire's counterattacks were fiercely intertwined. They were gradually turning the situation around. The remaining 200 gargoyles were unable to get close to the walls under the intense firepower, and gradually, they began to suffer casualties. The Empire's soldiers almost couldn't help but cheer. Although they didn't know how the battle inside the fortress was going, at least on the walls, they were about to win. As long as the enemy couldn't climb the walls, it was only a matter of time before the scales of victory tilted. But all of this only lasted until the appearance of the young wizard. Avram looked at the sudden battle with fear. Beside him, Eek and the officer from Yanalasu had already mounted their horses and were preparing to follow Meteshet to save the refugees. As for Avram, his mind was filled with thoughts of how to end the battle. No, it should be said that there was no way to end the battle. This damned Earl had actually launched a surprise attack on the Empire's fortress. This was something that couldn't be justified. He could almost imagine how furious the Emperor would be after hearing this news. What's more, He subconsciously thought that this sneak attack was most likely going to be a loss. He saw that with the help of the Empire's wizards, the Empire's guards were gaining the upper hand, while the Earl was still fighting with the Earth Dragon Knight. He actually sent a young wizard to deal with the battle on the walls. But what could a young wizard do? The knowledge and wisdom of a wizard were accumulated over the course of time. In Avram's imagination, those real wizards should be like those old pedants he saw in Karsuk. However, the name, Charles, did sound a little familiar. He couldn't help but glance at that person from the corner of his eyes. But after that glance, he couldn't look away anymore. The Shire slowly rose into the sky, his wizard robe fluttering in the cold wind. With his arrival, all the wizards on the battlefield subconsciously felt a sense of fear rising from the bottom of their hearts. An era ago, the flame of magic was ignited for the first time. A wise being taught this law that had never existed before to all the people of Silver and Black Iron. It was as if before that, no one understood the origin of law magic and elemental magic. It was different from divine spells and runic spells of the witches. But from that moment on, it was born in this world and shaped a great civilization. Where did magic come from? Perhaps only one person could answer this question. That person was Tumen. However, at this moment, all of the sorcerers felt a power that came from the same source. It was as if an ancient voice was calling out to its people, and the trembling that came from the depths of their souls was enough to shock everyone. The Shire was responding to the unknown being. Silver Staff Wizard, requesting permission as a planeswalker. Permission granted. The young wizard gently flicked his robe, his eyes flashing with silver flames. His gaze swept across the battlefield, and he couldn't help but reply with a strange tone. So, this is the power of a planeswalker. So, this is the source of the law. He raised a finger. In the name of the Scroll of Wisdom, the law, the flowing wind, and the shallow sea, I present the third law, the Dragon of Ether. At every moment, the energy is always changing forms. It sweeps and rushes, flowing endlessly. Thousands of years ago, the people of Fanner who worshipped the sun in the south of the Minor Plains had seen the miraculous scene of dragons migrating. They were as blue as the sea, sweeping across the sky. Thousands of years later, the people of Cruz witnessed this magnificent scene once again. P.S. You guys were complaining that my writing was all kinds of weak and not impressive. Now it's time to put in some effort. Alright, at the end of this chapter, I'm asking for more votes next month. Do you want to read more? There's more. Also, ignorance. Don't think of waiting for my forces. I'm not that good at PvP. This reminder is for your own good, got it? Chapter 9-11. A dreamy blue color filled the sky. Behind Charles, flashing summoning circles were emerging one after another. What swam out of them were dreamlike creatures that should only exist in legends. It was a life made up of pure energy. It was between substance and non-substance. It existed in the physical world, yet it did not exist in the physical world. Every moment, every minute, every second, they were constantly changing their attributes and forms. They were visitors from beyond their borders, the ether dragons. They had the shape of a dragon, but they also had a pair of wings like a manta ray. They were transparent, like soft glass or jellyfish that floated in the air. However, their form was not stable. They were constantly changing, like a rainbow with a blue background. One by one, the Cruz wizards stopped their spells. They realized that their spells had no effect on these strange creatures. These creatures themselves were a part of energy. They did not seem to exist in the physical world. Sharp lines of law and violent elemental magic tore through these dreamlike creatures, but they could not hurt them at all. It was as if they had hit an illusion, passing through their transparent bodies. Everyone realized this fact one by one. Their attacks were unable to harm these dragons at all. The entire battlefield gradually fell into a strange state of silence. The wizards and the soldiers of the Empire all stopped their attacks in bewilderment. Some of them looked at all this in silence, admiring the magnificent scenery. But finally, someone realized what this was. These are ether dragons. I didn't expect them to exist. The records of the Fanner people were not absurd legends. The wizards whispered to each other, passing on the secret knowledge that only they knew. On the other hand, the Imperial commander on the Black Sword Fortress was infuriated. He had no interest in the so-called knowledge and legends, but the wizards had left their posts without permission, which greatly reduced the intensity of the firepower on the battlefield. It was not easy to gain the upper hand, but now the gargoyles had taken it back. He went to the leader of the wizards and pointed at the strange creatures. I don't care what they are, but your mission now is to chase them all out. I don't want to see any of these messy things on my wall. He shouted. He threw a tantrum, but found that the wizards were looking at him strangely. What? Did I say something wrong? Those are spirits from the ether, Sir Commander. They are the symbol of pure energy. Our spells can't hurt them at all. Have you ever seen a drop of water drowning in the ocean? Besides, to us, they are the real ocean, the wizard leader replied politely. The Knight Commander scratched his head. I don't care who is the water droplet and who is the ocean, but you have to tell me how to deal with these things, right? I don't want my soldiers to die without knowing why. Commander, you don't have to worry at all. If the Fanner people are not lying, the ether dragon's biggest characteristic is that they exist in two worlds at the same time. Their constantly changing energy forms maintain the connection between the ether and the physical world. If you can't fight them in two worlds at the same time, then your attacks won't hurt them at all. The wizard leader looked at the beautiful creatures outside the city wall with a look of admiration, but the Knight Commander was obviously dissatisfied with the way he looked at them. At least, he didn't think that it was the look of an enemy. Of course, he didn't understand that the ether dragons were the symbol of magic. Their blue color was the color of the Bugha's flag. Although the Bughas were known as the Silver Alliance, their emblem was an eye on the blue ocean. It symbolized the two extremes of the wizard world, knowledge and magic. Doesn't that mean that I can't do anything to them? Why don't we just surrender? The Knight Commander replied impatiently. Why do you say that, Sir Commander? The wizard leader pretended to be surprised and looked at the Knight Commander, but in his heart, he was full of contempt for this poor man who knew nothing about the nature of the world. They can attack me, but we can't attack them. Can we still fight this war? Sir Commander, I don't think you need to worry about this at all. The wizard leader smiled. The ether dragon is a fragile and beautiful creature. It's not as powerful as you think. Although they look huge, it's only because their energy will naturally disperse in our world. And these creatures are actually very weak. Although they represent energy itself, they can't master the laws. It's like saying that humans represent a kind of life, but they can't control the laws of life. You and your soldiers can't attack them because they can't attack you. The commander didn't understand at all, but at least he understood the last sentence. He couldn't help but frown and ask, "You're saying that these things have no attacking ability at all? Then why did our opponent summon them? Are they trying to trick us?" "I'm afraid that's not the case. What I mean is, it's not that they can't attack you, but the realm of ether and the physical world are parallel worlds. The two worlds don't affect each other. If they want to affect our world, they have to switch to our world." "Wait, I get it." The commander interrupted this self-righteous guy and said loudly, "You mean when they switch to our world, I can attack them, right?" The wizard leader looked at this guy with some surprise. The Knight Commander couldn't help but snort coldly in his heart. He thought to himself, "These self-righteous guys." If he could, he wouldn't bother to deal with these weird guys. But he still had one last question. Before he left, he asked, "Sir Wizard, since these things are so fragile, then the person who summoned them can't be that powerful. I think you should be able to deal with him. Don't let him do anything else." But this time, he didn't get the answer he wanted. All the magi present looked at Charles in the sky with fear lingering in their hearts. "Sir Commander, you're wrong. The ether dragon itself represents something beyond your imagination. The ether dragon can't master the laws, but he can. We still don't know who this master is, but we can be sure that he has mastered a deeper level of the laws. All of us here can testify to this. Just a moment ago, we all felt the vibration from the sea of magic." The wizard leader shook his head with a solemn expression. "You may not understand what I'm telling you, Sir Commander, but I have a suggestion for you. You'd better use your soldiers to create some trouble for him. Otherwise, we may not be his match." "What?" The commander was shocked. "But he looks much younger than you." "In the world of wizards, knowledge and power are the strongest, not age," the wizard leader replied. "Are you sure?" "I'm not sure." The wizard leader shook his head. "It's just a guess. But you can bet that I'm wrong, Sir Commander." The commander glanced at these wizards in long robes and hoped that he was wrong. But he didn't know that everyone present had the same idea. Savannah raised her head and saw this scene. She saw the Empire's soldiers launch a desperate counterattack. The azure sea looked so dazzling, but it was incredibly fragile. The ether dragon's attack was far less dazzling than their appearance. She could clearly analyze that the strength of these strange creatures was no higher than the peak of the silver level. They were on par with most of the Empire's knights on the city wall. And what was gratifying was that after the ether dragons launched their attack, they quickly suffered casualties. The attacks that could not hurt them before, when they switched to the material world, shot them down from the sky for the first time. But the ether creatures that fell from the sky often ended their lives in a strange way. It was like a dazzling self-explosion. Their transparent bodies crashed into the city wall and then exploded into a light blue ripple. Under the shock of the ripple, the Empire's soldiers were unharmed, and the city wall was not damaged at all. The only change was that the spells of the Empire's wizards began to become sparse. The lady vaguely understood what was going on, but what she found strange was that the number of ether dragons was decreasing very fast, far faster than the speed of their deaths. They seemed to have occupied the whole sky before, but in an instant, there were only a few left. Where did the ether dragons go? She vaguely felt that something was wrong, but she didn't know what the problem was. But what really puzzled Ms. Venna was that this was what Brando wanted her to see. So that she could admire how he failed. But she obviously did not see such frustration on the face of this descendant of Darius. Brando was still smiling as he looked at the sky. That confident look had never faded. The ether dragons in the sky finally disappeared one by one. But this was not good news for the Empire's wizards. They were speechless. They had never seen these legendary creatures, and did not expect them to burn their magic after death. This only led to one result, and that was that all the wizards who were caught off guard had their magic depleted in the first moment. A few of the more senior wizards were still fine, but the apprentices around them were all pale and swaying. The ether dragons were upgraded from the young wind spirit dragons and spiders, and this characteristic was also in the same vein. But immediately, someone discovered a new problem. They're disappearing at the wrong speed. No, they're not disappearing. They're moving to the ether realm, Captain. The wizards were much more knowledgeable than a mere swordsman like Venna, and immediately realized the problem. But at this moment, the Shire was turning the face of the card. The Planeswalker's law was like a flame, burning fiercely in his body. This flame seemed to ignite his eyes, making them shine with the same silver light. He looked down at the crew's stronghold from above, and there seemed to be two different consciousnesses in his mind. One was thinking about the battle situation, and the other was counting carefully. After the Empire's wizards were defeated, the gargoyles began to regain the upper hand. Although they still had to face the difficult Empire's longbowmen, at least they did not have to face the risk of being torn apart by terrible spells at any time and place. Moreover, the magic defense of the Black Sword Rampart was gradually weakening, and the wizards who injected magic into it were now depleted of their magic. And in the Shire's body, the magic that had been completely exhausted in order to summon the ether dragons was slowly recovering, and the speed of recovery seemed to be gradually increasing as the ether dragons disappeared. And this rising magic was once again injected into the face of the ether dragons. Then, a new batch of ether dragons appeared in the sky. The crew's people were looking up at the sky, and a considerable number of them even opened their mouths wide. "Look over there, there's more over there. There's more here too. Kill them. They're disappearing again. New monsters have appeared again." It was chaos on the city wall. The Empire's soldiers and wizards were dumbfounded as they watched the ether dragons appear and disappear and reappear. But every time they disappeared, they would bring new companions with them, as if they were increasing geometrically. No one understood what was going on, but the ether dragons seemed to have really converged into an ocean, and when they launched their last attack, the terrifying tsunami-like scene finally arrived. In the face of thousands of uncountable enemies, even the proudest Krolutzians could not help but throw away the weapons in their hands weakly. That was a battle that no longer had any meaning. The Shire seemed to be controlling this sea of magic that was full of power, and the ocean blue magic energy gathered under his feet. It was not that the Empire's commanders did not think of attacking him, but it was meaningless. Every time they were about to achieve their goal, a pure silver holy shield would appear in front of the Shire. That was the holy song of protection. Hippamra held the will of the mountains in her hand, and had the support of endless magic from the ether dragons. She had chosen the target of this spell countless times. The last scene that Savannah saw was that the blue ocean had completely covered the city wall of the Black Sword Fortress. It was not that she had never seen such a spectacular scene, but that was during the Holy War, when she was facing the most powerful wizards of St. Tassol. She seemed to have finally recognized the young wizard. "It's him," the lady muttered to herself in disbelief. "He's not dead. The genius of the Black Tower wizards, I should have known. He has always been so unexpected." Brando was slightly startled. It seemed that this was the second time he had heard such words. He could not help but raise his head and look at the Shire in the sky. Savannah had already retracted her gaze. Cruz's men had been completely defeated, and the reinforcements in the fortress had yet to arrive. She could already imagine what had happened. "You won," she replied calmly. "I just didn't expect that after 40 years, he would actually become a great wizard. The Black Tower wizards finally have a wizard leader after 1,000 years. Those who made the decision back then must have never thought that this day would come. But grandson of Darius, what have you gained? Other than the hatred of the Empire, you have gained nothing." Brando knew that this lady, who was known as the White Swordsman, must have misunderstood something. She actually thought that the Shire had crossed the extreme plane and become a great wizard. However, he did not expose this misunderstanding. In fact, this misunderstanding was exactly what he needed at the moment. As for what he had gained, he looked at the blue reflection in the sky and gently shook his head. The people of the Empire would never understand what he had gained. Count Tonajul had gone mad. Whether it was in Yenbao or Grey Harbor, whether it was from the north of the kingdom to the south of Ampere Seal, or from Ranner to the dense forests of Grinoires, as long as there were people living there, whether it was the nobles, the commoners, or even those with unknown identities and ulterior motives, all of them were discussing the news that came back from Balta after the weather in the north had turned cold and there were a couple of snowflakes. The royal faction had also gone mad. Other than Makarov, Oberway, and the Wolf Baron, everyone else was like a shark that smelled blood. They were already dissatisfied with the Count who ordered them around, and now they were venting their dissatisfaction through various channels. Secret letters were passed to Makarov and the other leaders of the royal faction, and every word written on them was enough to make even the boldest of radicals tremble in fear. It was full of words of advice, abuse, criticism, questioning, and even slander. Makarov could only smile bitterly at Oberway. These things were too obvious, and he could not help but doubt the intelligence of his colleagues. But what made him doubt his own intelligence was the other letters piled up on his desk. These letters were not slander, but letters from the north that conveyed some kind of message. The words written in bright red on the letters were enough to make anyone who read them think that they were reading a ridiculous story. On the 25th of the month of Frost, Count Tonagel conquered the Black Sword Fortress. In this battle, other than the Count himself losing his gargoyles, there were few casualties. After that, Count Tonagel forced, or rather, escorted, the entire imperial army to hold a grand welcoming ceremony for Erewhon's diplomatic group. After that, he released all the captives and compensated the Knight's Gate out of courtesy. On the 27th of the month of Frost, Count Tonagel and his diplomatic group passed through the Tory Canyon and defeated several Cruz nobles who came to challenge them. On the 30th of the month of Frost, Count Tonagel and his diplomatic group conquered the Tory territory and extorted a large sum of ransom called compensation for the damage to their reputation and compensation for mental anguish before releasing all the nobles. On the 7th of the month of Winterharp, Count Tonagel defeated the Cruz's Solstice Knights Legion. On the 15th of the month of Winterharp, Count Tonagel and his diplomatic group defeated Anzarudda's army. On the 19th of the month of Winterharp, Count Tonagel, Makarov and Oberway silently read the last sentence of the letter and gently placed it in front of Princess Griffine. They couldn't help but ask tiredly, "All right, Your Highness, can you please tell me what Count Tonagel wants to do?" Princess Griffine glanced at the letter with a guilty conscience. Then, she forced a smile at her two courtiers. "I think His Lordship, he should know what to do." "Really?" Makarov looked at the princess silently. Chapter 9-12. Bettina, you're back. As soon as the maidservant with a lovely round face entered the room, she was surrounded by several other maidservants who chattered and greeted her. Bettina patted her apron and raised her eyebrows to look at the mistress of the house. She then made a gesture to the other maidservants to keep quiet and asked in a low voice, "Shuv, let me ask you, after I left, did the Countess have a good rest?" Hearing this question, the sisters immediately became gloomy. Since Scarlet had been placed under house arrest by Her Majesty the Queen, she had been very depressed all day, and sometimes she would talk to her spear, which they did not know where it came from. This made them very suspicious, and they wondered if there was something wrong with the Countess's head. Every day, they had to report Scarlet's daily routine to Her Majesty the Queen. Her Majesty obviously still cared about Scarlet very much. At least, she never let outsiders handle this matter. Every time, she would personally take time out of her busy schedule to listen to Bettina's report. However, regarding the Countess's strange behavior, Her Majesty did not say anything, so naturally, they did not dare to speculate. Scarlet was always depressed. She did not eat much and slept very little. It was a headache for them. Seeing the expression on the maidservants' faces, Bettina understood something. She sighed and said, "Sigh, let the Countess have a good rest. Don't make a fuss anymore. She must be homesick, but Her Majesty the Queen does not allow her to go back." "Yes, yes," the maidservants replied in unison, "we children from the mountains are always nostalgic for our homeland. I often remember the maple trees in my hometown." Another maidservant looked at Bettina's face and asked in a low voice, "Bettina, you don't look very good. Is Her Majesty the Queen in a bad mood again?" Shoo! Bettina glared at the maidservant. Don't talk nonsense, but Her Majesty's mood is quite bad today. What's wrong? This question seemed to have aroused the maidservant's curiosity. They hurriedly lowered their voices and asked. Isn't it because of the Countess? Bettina sighed. She did not know how many times she had sighed. It was as if Her Majesty's bad mood had affected her. Is it that Count from the countryside again? Lower your voice, idiot, Betessa replied. That Countess came from Erewhon. Do you know Erewhon? It's a small kingdom in the south of the empire. That's right, our Countess also came from there. Don't let her hear you talk about her hometown like that. What Countess from the countryside? How unpleasant it sounds. The maids were startled, and their faces showed lingering fear. Some of them even looked into the room with a guilty conscience. But when they realized that Scarlet didn't seem to be listening to them, they heaved a sigh of relief and hurriedly turned back to ask, Bettina, quickly tell us, what happened to the Count? Since Scarlet was under house arrest in the courtyard of the castle, the maidservants naturally couldn't leave, except for Bettina, who had to go to the rose garden to see Her Majesty every once in a while. Girls of their age were full of vitality and curiosity, so they were even more attracted to the outside world, even if it was a small thing. Bettina was a little older, so when she saw the pitiful eyes of her companions, she could only reply, the Count arrested the local nobles in Seruf. When I went there, I saw Duke Pallet complaining to Her Majesty in the rose garden. She suddenly showed a clever smile and said disrespectfully to the Duke, You didn't see the Duke's flustered and exasperated look, I've never seen him like this before. Bettina, did you say that the Count went to Seruf? The maidservants seemed to be used to such news, and they didn't seem surprised at all. It seemed that since half a month ago, the southern nobles were beaten to a pulp, and it had become a common occurrence in the whole king's city. But they noticed something else and asked curiously, So, in less than a month, we will be able to see the Count? Before he completely infuriates Her Majesty, Betessa pouted. When Duke Pallet and Her Majesty were talking, she only dared to stand aside and listen with her head lowered. However, this did not prevent her from hearing how bad Her Majesty's mood was. Besides, she had secretly seen Her Majesty's expression later on. Her face was always cold, but today it was even colder than usual. It was enough to make people's teeth chatter. Bettina thought for a moment and added with a lingering fear, If Her Majesty doesn't hang the Count, maybe we will have a chance to see him. What are you talking about, Bettina? At this time, a slightly low voice sounded. All the maidservants were startled. They were talking so intensely that they didn't even notice when Scarlet came in. The mountain maiden stood by the door of her room and looked at them, and the maidservants were like a flock of startled sparrows. They all shut their mouths, and the room suddenly quieted down. Bettina glared at her disloyal companions and whispered to Scarlet, My lady. You are talking about Erewhon. Scarlet didn't care about the matter, but stared at Bettina and asked in a somewhat anxious tone. Oh no, the Count must have heard us, Bettina thought. But she didn't dare to lie, so she answered honestly, Yes, my lady. Tell me the truth, Scarlet said with a pale face. In fact, she often couldn't sleep these days. Every time she closed her eyes, she would think of the Count, and it would disturb her. We are talking about a Count from Erewhon. A Count from Erewhon. As soon as Scarlet heard this, she immediately rushed to Bettina's side and grabbed the round-faced maidservant's arm like a ghost and asked loudly. Ah! Bettina had never seen Scarlet like this and couldn't help but jump in fright. Where did that Count come from? My lady, I don't know. Her Majesty and the nobles didn't mention it, so I didn't dare to ask. Bettina quickly replied. Scarlet pursed her lips and didn't say anything. The young girl's sharp premonition made her realize something, but she couldn't think of a good way to ask at the moment. Betessa trembled as she looked at the Count. When she saw the look of confidence and desire in the Count's eyes, she seemed to have understood what was going on. She trembled as she asked, "Count, do you want to hear about his deeds?" Scarlet nodded seriously. "All right, it's like this." Bettina took a deep breath and slowly opened her mouth. After Duke Peruth left, Constance's expression became slightly better. At this time, the Imperial Chancellor, Fjodna Nydivan, who was known as Junior Nydivan, hurried into the Queen's private study in the Rose Garden. The supreme ruler of the Empire looked at him and asked, "What's wrong, Chancellor? Did the Count cause some trouble again?" Junior Nydivan looked at the Queen in surprise. Before he came, he heard from the Chamberlain that the Queen was furious, but now it seemed that was far from the truth. Not only was the Queen not angry, but she also seemed to be in a good mood. Even so, Junior Nydivan didn't dare to relax. He quickly bowed respectfully and answered with a little embarrassment, "Your Majesty, you are very accurate." Indeed, after the Count detained the nobles of Thuruf, a group of young people wanted to take revenge on him, but unfortunately, they were all taken hostage. I heard that the nobles of the south were no longer angry with the Count and were discussing ransom for the hostages, but the old Duke didn't seem to be willing to do so. The old Duke he mentioned was naturally the previous head of the House of Peruth. The House of Peruth was the representative of the new nobles of the Cruz Empire. It was no secret that they had a close relationship with the nobles of the south. In fact, it was because of this that the Queen supported them to become an important force in the imperial court. Which family's children were taken from? Constance asked casually. It was mainly the House of Alcorn and the House of Jean. Your Majesty, the Duchess is from the House of Jean, Fjodna Nydivan reminded. I don't need you to remind me. Of course I know, Her Majesty replied, these self-righteous fellows dare to look down on the guests I invited. It's good to let them suffer a little. Junior Nydivan seemed to have understood the ins and outs of the matter. He quickly replied, Your Majesty is right, but the Count is really too much. He doesn't give the Empire any face. The nobles of the Empire can't stand him fighting his way here. Humph, the Silver Queen snorted softly. It's normal for young people to be impetuous, but it's true that his grandfather was much calmer than him back then. It doesn't matter. A capable person can be forgiven for being arrogant and unruly. The Empire isn't so intolerant. But don't let him make a big deal out of it. He just wants to get our attention, but if every envoy group comes, the Empire won't be able to stand it. Let the local legions at the border be more vigilant. Even a mere Erewhon can step on their faces. Count Alcorn and Count Jean don't mind losing face. The Prime Minister of the Empire couldn't help but smile bitterly. This Count is really... I don't know how to describe him. He actually did such a thing. Even I almost thought that he was crazy. He's not crazy, Constance replied. This Count knows the Empire very well. He knows that we won't do anything to him. Moreover, this little guy knows his limits. Outsiders might not be able to tell, but I don't believe that you can't, Prime Minister. A thin layer of cold sweat immediately appeared on Junior Nydivan's forehead. He knew in his heart that although the Empire's supreme ruler was conversing with him casually, the Nydivan family's position in the Queen's heart was deteriorating day by day. On the contrary, because of the series of things that Brando had caused, he had met the Queen more often, and the relationship between them had eased up a little. However, the Queen's words immediately put him on edge. He hurriedly replied carefully, Your Majesty's eyes are like torches. That Count is, after all, that person's grandson. Indeed. The Queen nodded as if she agreed. Your Majesty, before I came, I heard that you were angry again. Junior Nydivan suddenly asked carefully. What? Your Majesty, your health. My health is very good. You don't have to worry about me, Prime Minister. Constance knew that this must be a message from Prime Minister Nydivan. Junior Nydiven's intelligence was not inferior to his father's, but he was much less courageous. I'm angry because of those useless nobles of the empire. Their faces have been trampled on. Instead of thinking about how to reclaim their glory, they want to tie their gains and losses to the empire. Cruz's people have not fallen to that extent. It's natural for them to want to take revenge on that count. I don't think Duke Palat will let this go, Your Majesty. Junior Nydiven shook his head and replied. I hope he doesn't cause too much trouble for me. Constance shook her head. Count Alcons and Count Jean know their limits. Junior Nydiven's answer did not match his heart. Constance looked at him and corrected him, I'm talking about him. The Prime Minister of the Empire was slightly startled and then smiled bitterly. Junior Nydiven stayed in the Rose Garden for half an hour and took time to report the situation in the west and east to the Supreme of the Empire. The Lion Beast men were still attacking the White Hart and Orcus fortresses. Compared to their decisiveness in assembling the army, the progress was slow. On the other hand, the Wind Elves persisted in their attacks in the wilderness of the Four Realms. The Red Army was one of the four main armies of the Empire, and their reputation was not undeserved. The mobilization within the Empire was nearing its end, and the atmosphere of war could be felt even in remote areas. After he said goodbye, Constance watched the Prime Minister of the Empire leave. When the study was empty, she gently tapped on the armrest of the chair and muttered to herself thoughtfully. Does he really know how to use the Heaven's armor? Did Jocelyn secretly go to Erewhon? No, he's not that shallow, Lady Gwendolen. I have a feeling that he's sending us a signal. What is he trying to say? Or is this the attitude of the people of Erewhon? Her cold voice echoed faintly in the empty study, but no one answered her question. Not only that. The story in the room had obviously been going on for some time, but it did not look like it was going to end anytime soon. Bettina continued, everyone thinks that the Count is crazy. He actually attacked one of the Empire's fortresses because he didn't receive the proper treatment. God, before this, I always thought that we, the mountain people, were the most rebellious people of the Empire. I didn't expect that compared to the Count, we are nothing. I've long heard that the people of Erewhon have a great king. When he founded the country, he swore that the people of Erewhon would independently protect their own people. I didn't expect it to be true. As she said that, the round-faced handmaiden could not help but sneak a glance at her liege. But she was disappointed to find that Scarlet was unmoved. She only asked blankly, and then? She sighed disappointedly and continued, and then, of course, the nobles of the Empire would not let it go. They gathered an army and wanted to teach this ignorant outsider a lesson. Of course, the result was not what they wanted. As for what happened after that, I've already told you, Count. That Count naturally captured all of them. Not only that, he also took them as hostages and demanded a large sum of ransom from their families. He even named it compensation for damage to reputation or compensation for mental damage or something like that. Scarlet shuddered as if she had been electrocuted. She looked up at her handmaiden and asked in disbelief, You said, compensation for mental damage. You didn't mention this to me before, Bettina. But that's not the point, Count. Bettina was baffled. But she did not notice that the Count in front of her was gritting his teeth. Once upon a time, she was the one who had been with the Count for the longest time. She had long gotten used to those strange terms. She used to think that it was the Count's only bad habit. But at this moment those words that he once couldn't understand sounded so familiar to him. Bettina was still rambling on. In my opinion, the Count did not have to offend the nobles of the Empire. After all, he is an outsider. If he flaunts his power now, he will have to suffer in the future. Her Majesty the Queen has been angry a few times because of this, and a few dukes hate him so much that they want to grind their teeth. The only praiseworthy thing is that the Count is in the limelight. Now, in the vicinity of Rusta, I'm afraid that there are very few people who do not know him. I really don't understand what he is trying to do. Halfway through her words, she suddenly froze. She suddenly saw the Count in front of her crying. She hurriedly called out, "Count, what happened to you?" Scarlet shook her head hard. Because she understood. Everything he had done was just to tell her one thing. "I am already here, Scarlet." Like a promise. P.S. I wrote so late today. The sword spirit did not play much. Sob, sob, sob. I brought Scarlet along to beg for monthly votes. Also, regarding the ether dragon that someone asked about yesterday, the cost of mana is actually a card's Esper ability. The cost of the ether dragon itself is 25 water. However, I also looked at the card's description, and there is actually a problem. I think it should be written as a barrier. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.